As historic tensions rise between the nations of China and Taiwan, it was the UK's Foreign Secretary James Cleverly who repopularized an interesting angle on the debate. What if the biggest loser in a large-scale occupation of Taiwan by Chinese forces was, in fact, China itself? Geopolitics has never been more complex than it is now, especially in this case considering that China is a nuclear state and Taiwan is a key partner of the United States, which could counter China's numerically superior military with its own world-class military technology, training, and spending. One thing that is absolutely certain is that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would quickly spill out of East Asia in scope and likely trigger a cataclysmic war between several nuclear-armed global superpowers. But how did we get here? What makes the war between China, Taiwan, and all their respective allies such a looming possibility? And most importantly for this video, what makes figures like James Cleverly so certain that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan will lead to a complete Chinese collapse? First, some important context. What is the history between Taiwan and China, and why does it make some kind of military conflict feel almost inevitable? As with any sticky geopolitical situation, we need to untangle the mess before we can understand it. The first thing you need to understand is that Taiwan is an island nation with a population of around 24 million people off the coast of a much larger China, and it's been an independent nation since 1949. Taiwan is officially known as the Republic of China, or ROC, and mainland China dubs itself the People's Republic of China, or PRC. How you feel about this probably depends on which side of the Taiwan Strait you ally with. Taiwan has a democratically elected government, but the PRC sees it as a kind of rogue state they hope to reunify with the mainland, using force if necessary. This approach to foreign policy is known as the One China principle, and comparisons have been drawn to Russia's takeover of Crimea and the attempted annexation of Ukraine. A lot of the differing interpretations between the two countries originated from a consensus formed in 1992 by negotiators from the Chinese Communist Party, the ruling party of the PRC, and the Kuomintang, which at the time was the ruling party of Taiwan. Both nominally agreed to the idea of a One China principle, with the issue being that each country believed themselves to be the One China in their own interpretation of the consensus. But even the name of the consensus is misleading, as it would imply some kind of, actual consensus across all parties involved. The Kuomintang has always generally been sympathetic to the interests of Beijing, with the Kuomintang draft of the Taiwanese constitution not emphasizing the sovereignty of the ROC from the PRC. This line of thought is staunchly opposed by the other primary party in Taiwan, the Democratic Progressive Party, which currently rules the country with President Tsai Ing-wen as the leader. There was a kind of uneasy peace between the two countries until matters escalated when Tsai Ing-wen was elected as president in 2016. During one of her first speeches as president, she explicitly rejected the 1992 consensus and called for a revaluation of Taiwan's relationship with the mainland. In response, China cut diplomatic ties and escalated its military saber-rattling by flying fighter jets closer and closer to the island and escalating the aggression of its anti-Taiwanese sovereignty rhetoric. President of the PRC, Xi Jinping, has stressed the ideal situation for both nations is a one-country, two-systems policy which would reintegrate Taiwan into the PRC while also allowing it some level of sovereignty, similar to the relationship between China and Hong Kong. But critics of Xi have understandably pointed out the PRC's recent crackdown on the freedoms of citizens in Hong Kong as a reason to believe Beijing's promises of Taiwanese sovereignty aren't necessarily worth the paper they're printed on. Global superpowers have been choosing both sides. Both the Trump and Biden administrations have shown an uncharacteristic closeness to Taiwan, with Joe Biden being the first president of the United States to invite Taiwanese representatives to his presidential inauguration, a powerful symbolic gesture that drew the ire of the PRC. The United States also had continued selling weapons to Taiwan and participating in joint military training exercises. Bipartisan measures have passed U.S. Congress to increase support for U.S.-Taiwan relations, and the U.S. government has lately been encouraging Taiwan to increase its defense spending. But Taiwan isn't alone in needing to increase its defense because you're also at risk of being attacked. That's right, there's a big, glaring hole in your own defense, and it comes from your data. And that's why we're so thankful for the sponsor of today's video, Delete Me. Delete Me is a hands-free subscription service that will remove your personal information that's being sold online. Who's selling it, you ask? Data brokers. Those shadowy organizations compile information about you and your family, everything from your birthday, your phone number, court records, even your home address. All of this info and much more is often available to whoever is willing to pay. which opens you and your loved ones to the risk of being doxxed, harassed, or even attacked. There's a real danger to having that information out there on the web in the hands of data brokers, which is why I decided to use Delete Me. So how does it work? Once you sign up, Delete Me experts will begin finding and removing all of your personal information that's out there on the web. After 7 days, you'll receive a detailed Delete Me report outlining all the different places your information has been found. But it doesn't stop there. Delete Me continues to keep you safe by scanning and deleting all your data all year, removing your personal information again from any place it's appeared every 3 months. When I saw my own report, I couldn't believe how many different sites my data was up on for anyone to come and purchase. And what was most surprising was how much of it there was. Multiple addresses, including my current one, phone numbers, and email addresses, you name it, it was out there. So don't wait any longer. Try out Delete Me for yourself and see just how much of your own data is in the hands of data brokers. Just go to joindeleteme.com/GEO and make sure to use my special code GEO for 20% off. You and your data will thank me once you do. Now back to China and Taiwan. Another important symbolic gesture in this regard is the fact that the US regularly sends ships through the Taiwan Strait as a form of posturing, demonstrating their presence in the area in a way that sends a strong message to the PRC. Things escalated even further with the involvement of 2 different high-ranking US politicians engaging in unprecedented acts of diplomacy with Taiwan. Former House Speakers Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy both engaged in diplomatic pleasantries with President Tsai. It probably won't be surprising to hear that the PRC views all of this as escalation and has responded accordingly with sanctions, rhetoric, and displays of military might. According to a 2021 report from the U.S. Department of Defense, the PRC is, quote, likely preparing for a contingency to unify Taiwan with the PRC by force, while simultaneously deterring, delaying, or denying any third-party intervention, such as the United States. Needless to say, this is an incredibly concerning prospect for all involved. Debates have raged about when this military action is likely to take place, with predictions over the previous few years falling flat. In 2021, a key U.S. military leader in the Indo-Pacific projected a Chinese invasion of Taiwan by 2031. Other predictions have stressed 2049 as a potential date, in accordance with President Xi Jinping's rhetoric around the Chinese dream, the idea that by 2049, the centenary of the founding of the PRC, China will return to its historic greatness and become a major player on the world stage. Xi has directly said multiple times that the Chinese dream would be impossible without the reunification of China and Taiwan under the One China principle. And as we've alluded to before, China is no slouch militarily. Not only does the Chinese People's Liberation Army, or PLA, boast the largest number of military personnel on the planet, but it's also undergone an extensive military modernization plan over the prior decade. In 2019, a military white paper released by the PLA confidently stated that they would be able to, quote, resolutely defeat anyone attempting to separate Taiwan from China. Not exactly mincing words, though it is extremely important to take reports on a country's own army with at least a little pinch of salt, as propaganda is a key tool in everyone's foreign policy. Certain precursors to war have already begun, eerily shadowing the situation between Russia and Ukraine. There's been evidence of Beijing interfering in Taiwanese elections through coordinated disinformation campaigns and attempts to influence Taiwan's media. Taiwan's also accused Beijing of mounting thousands of cyber attacks against the country since 2010, restricting tourism to Taiwan and sailing warships and aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Strait in order to threaten and intimidate the island nation. Throughout all of this, Taiwan has always held one special bargaining chip that gives it economic sway amongst the rest of the world, and thus a good reason for countries like the United States to ensure stability remains in the region: semiconductor chips. Taiwan is actually the world's leading manufacturer of these chips, which are essential to the production of everything from washing machines to military weapon systems. Corporations the world over need semiconductor chips like the ones produced in Taiwan in order to function, and a protracted Chinese invasion would upset the supply chain in an unprecedented fashion. Which brings us nicely to the real meat of this geopolitical conversation. On the dreadful day that the Chinese invasion of Taiwan does occur, if that day ever comes, what will be the impact? And why do people like the UK's Foreign Secretary believe this could be just as catastrophic for the PRC as anyone else involved in the conflict? James Cleverly has stated that any war between China and Taiwan will compromise the Taiwan Strait, one of the world's most important trade routes, which would not only negatively impact global trade, but completely collapse the Chinese economy by gridlocking their ability to conduct their own trade. Given that China's previously booming economy seems to have cooled down over the past few years, it puts them in a precarious position that could make engaging in an invasion of Taiwan potentially even more risky. Cleverly said, about half the world's container ships pass through these vital waters every year, laden with goods bound for Europe and the far corners of the world. Taiwan is a thriving democracy and a crucial link in global supply chains, particularly for advanced semiconductors. A war across the strait would not only be a human tragedy, it would destroy world trade worth $2.6 trillion, according to Nikkei Asia. No country could shield itself from the repercussions. Distance would offer no protection from this catastrophic blow to the global economy. That being said, many economists also believe that the perception of China's economy as a fragile house of cards is simply wishful thinking. According to Michael Pettis, professor of finance at the Guanghua School of Management at Peking University in Beijing, many analysts have concluded that China is on the verge of a crisis, but they do not understand China's heavily controlled financial system, in which regulators can restructure liabilities almost at will. China is very unlikely to suffer from a financial crisis or sudden collapse. Much more likely is many years of slowing growth as it grinds away at debt and slowly rebalances demand towards more consumption and less non-productive investment. However, Pettis' statement was made in a peacetime context. An invasion of Taiwan could be the spark that sets this tinderbox ablaze. A study from Charlie Vest, Agatha Kratz, and Riva Gojon, entitled "The Global Economic Disruptions from a Taiwan Conflict," also offers some interesting insights on the devastating impacts of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. One particularly pertinent portion of the study states, every year banks provide $6.5 to $8 trillion in finance to help importers and exporters facilitate trade while goods are in transit. This short-term finance underpins as much as one-third of trade flows. In the event of a conflict between China and Taiwan, risk-averse global investors would pull back from lending activities, reducing the availability of trade finance and thus impairing international trade. This would mean that the entire global market would become paralyzed as imports and exports from countries across the world fail to make it to their destinations. With imports and exports at a standstill, entire industries and perhaps economies across the world would collapse, leading to a global financial downturn that would envy the Wall Street crash of 1929. Keen military minds may have noticed the phrase, "even assuming no sanctions." To assume a lack of sanctions is extremely generous, as a Taiwan invasion would inevitably activate a bevy of devastating sanctions from the international community. Let's take the consequences that the Ukraine invasion had on Russia as an example of the kind of severe financial sanctions that China might face if it invaded Taiwan. Russia experienced the assets of its central banks being frozen across Western Europe and the United States. Russian banks were effectively pushed out of the global banking community, and many countries such as the UK banned Russian firms from receiving loans. Russian citizens were even subject to depositing limits at banks across the EU. According to the UK government, Western countries cut off around $350 billion of Russia's $604 billion foreign currency reserve. Russian businesses were hit, limiting their ability to operate abroad, and several Russian oligarchs saw their considerable assets frozen in foreign banks. In the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, it's not unreasonable to expect that these same financial consequences would hit China while Taiwan's allies were mustering their military response. While China's exports have given them a lot of international sway, they also lack Russia's oil wealth to fall back on, meaning that sanctions like these may hit them even harder. Another interesting wrinkle to all this data is the result of a war game simulation conducted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, an independent Washington think tank, earlier in 2023. The intention was simple. If a Chinese invasion of Taiwan broke out in 2026, who would win the conflict, and what would be the overall cost to those involved? The CSIS ran the simulation an unprecedented 24 times just to make sure all the relevant data points were being properly considered. The first bombshell result of the report was that the invasion would not be a success for the PRC, but the cost to all involved would be horrific. According to CNN, extrapolating from an early preview of the report, a successful win from Taiwan was facilitated by 4 consistent factors across all models. Taiwan's ground forces must be able to contain Chinese beachheads, The US must be able to use its bases in Japan for combat operations. The US must have long-range anti-ship missiles to hit the PLA Navy from afar and en masse. And the US needs to fully arm Taiwan before shooting starts and jump into any conflict with its own forces immediately. But a victory doesn't mean a lack of fallout on all sides. The report stated, the United States and Japan lose dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of service members. Such losses would damage the US global position for many years. According to the majority of simulations, 3,200 US soldiers would die in the opening weeks of the conflict, and the US would also lose 2 aircraft carriers and 10 to 20 large surface combatants during the battles in the Taiwan Strait. But this is not to imply that China would be unscathed. According to the CSIS report, China also suffers heavily. Its navy is in shambles, the core of its amphibious forces is broken, and tens of thousands of soldiers become prisoners of war. On top of all that, data from the study suggest that 10,000 Chinese troops would die, and 155 combat aircraft and 138 major ships would also be lost. Japan, who would side with the US and Taiwan, would lose over 100 combat aircraft and 26 warships, as well as suffer home territory damage from Chinese attacks on the US military bases on their soil. Taiwan, even though most models predict it retaining its sovereignty, would still suffer some pretty horrific losses under basically all scenarios. According to the report, while Taiwan's military is unbroken, it is severely degraded and left to defend a damaged economy on an island without electricity and basic services. The nation's army would likely suffer around 3,500 casualties, along with the destruction of their entire navy. It also goes without saying that given the majority of the ground fighting would be in Taiwan, infrastructural and collateral damage is basically inevitable. We've already highlighted comparisons made between the potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but the CSIS report and related experts also want to stress certain vital differences. Many academics and military officials have suggested that China may observe and learn from certain operational errors made by Russia, but if this report is to be believed, the same won't be true for Taiwan and the US. The report claims there will be no Ukraine model for NATO conduct in a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, meaning that it'll be unfeasible to turn the invasion into an indirect proxy war, where Taiwan can be discreetly fed weapons and supplies. According to Mark Kansian, one of the CSIS project leaders, once the war begins, it's impossible to get any troops or supplies into Taiwan. So it's a very different situation from Ukraine, where the United States and its allies have been able to send supplies continuously to Ukraine. Whatever the Taiwanese are going to fight the war with, they have to have that when the war begins. But let's not get carried away with the idea that war is an inevitability, because according to CSIS, it simply isn't the case. Why? Because the PRC is just as aware as anyone else that an invasion of Taiwan could be their ultimate ruin. Dan Grazier, a senior defense policy fellow at the Project on Government Oversight, also known by the oddly whimsical acronym POGO, echoed the sentiments of the UK's Foreign Secretary James Cleverly and his US counterpart, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, by saying that China's risk of total economic collapse may keep them from ever escalating to a full military invasion. Grazier stated, "The Chinese are going to do everything they can, in my estimation, to avoid a military conflict with anybody." Grazier's estimation is based on the fact that China's economy rests on the undisrupted flow of imports and exports. Interrupting continuous trade would quickly wreak havoc on the Chinese economy, with exports from their manufacturing sector being the backbone of their international influence. And the importation of food and fuel is vital to keep the very engine of their economy chugging along. Any disruption to the flow of these goods would be catastrophic. Even so, there's another model predicting that an invasion of Taiwan might be the PRC cutting off its nose to spite its own face. The CSIS report stated, the Chinese leadership might adopt a strategy of diplomatic isolation, gray zone pressure, or economic coercion against Taiwan. Diplomatic isolation and economic coercion are self-explanatory, but gray zone pressure may require a bit more of an explanation. In geopolitical terms, the gray zone is everything between a state of true peace and active war. Cyber attacks, election interference, propaganda, and spies. In other words, everything China has already been doing. As we discussed earlier, while Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party wants to preserve the sovereignty of the ROC, all it would take is one election to put a figurehead more sympathetic to the interests of Beijing into power and change everything. Why would Xi Jinping and the PRC risk it all in a dangerous and unpredictable war when they can maneuver their way into power far more delicately, even if it extends the timeline. Though an important caveat was added by Mark Kansian, who stated, "Wars happen even when objective analysis might indicate the attacker might not be successful. Even global superpowers are made up of fallible people whose decision-making abilities are subject to the same biases and fallacies as anyone else. Even the knowledge of a potential collapse of their own economy and the devastation of their own military might not be enough to stop the People's Republic of China from trying to achieve the Chinese dream by any means necessary." Is China set to become the world's next great military superpower? Some might argue that's already the case. While the United States still leads the way in annual military spending, $877 billion was pumped into the U.S. military in 2022 alone, China is still firmly in second place. And while its spending of $292 billion might seem like pocket change in comparison to the U.S.'s mighty military machine, often it's how you use the military budget, not the size, that counts. You see, China isn't necessarily preparing for an all-out war with anybody. Instead, it's spending to support those who line with its political agenda, combined with several discrete military movements that all seem to be leading China to achieving global political supremacy. But what are those discrete military movements exactly? And perhaps more importantly, how does China's approach to its military funding set the stage for its development into the most powerful political player in the world? To answer those questions, we need to take a deeper dive into China's military strategy, starting with the country's biggest weapon of all, nukes. According to Newsweek, the country has stockpiled an impressive 500 nuclear warheads, all operational for its own protection. And while this is dwarfed by the stockpiles held by the Russians and the United States, with both reportedly having 5,000 nuclear warheads each, the fact that China has jumped from 400 to 500 warheads between 2020 and today suggests the country is actively looking to make itself a bigger nuclear threat on the world stage. Anybody who lived through the Cold War knows precisely why. Mutually assured destruction. In the 20th century, the Soviet Union and the US found themselves embroiled in a cold conflict that never resulted in the two nations fighting directly, but it did involve them supporting many other nations and movements designed to enhance their own political strength. The only reason the Soviet Union and America didn't come to blows back then was because each packed a nuclear arsenal so massive they could destroy the entire world. The Soviets send a nuke, America responds with one of its own. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. At least if the initial nuclear blast didn't blind you already. Having already seen the protective impact that having a nuclear arsenal can have, China has likely upped its nuke production significantly in recent years because of the political strength that comes from being a nuclear nation. Now China has the power to exert itself more openly on the global stage because it has the firepower to back its actions up. And while we can all hope that the days of mutually assured destruction are behind us, there is no denying it's a powerful negotiating tool to bring to the table, power that China intends on exploiting. The rise in nuke production is far from the only military strengthening that China has been doing, though. As little as 20 years ago, China was seen as the factory to the world. It's where many powerful nations went to get goods manufactured. But its military, though large, was disorganized and relied on massively outdated equipment. Over the last 2 decades, this has drastically changed. China has engaged in a modernistic military movement, essentially upgrading its forces every year. In fact, China's military budget increased by about 10% per year for every year between 2000 and 2016, resulting in it spending more on its armed forces than any other nation other than the US. And that money has been used very well. According to Major General Cameron Holt, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, China is buying up military equipment at a rate that outstrips the United States by a ratio of up to 6 to 1. Yes, the US is still spending more, a lot more, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's getting more and better equipment. In fact, Major General Holt believes that China spends $1 for every 20 the US spends to acquire equipment with the same capabilities. Using that as a basic ratio, we can multiply China's $292 billion in 2022 spending by 20 to see that the US would have to spend $5.84 trillion per year to keep up with China's current military budget. So China might be spending less, but the money it has goes a lot further. So much so that it's actually receiving far more equipment for what it spends than the supposed biggest military spenders in the world. That money isn't just going to nukes, it's being spent on training, diversifying its ballistic missiles collection, aircraft, boats, and so much more. In short, China's packing a huge amount of equipment because it knows that strengthening its military is the fastest and perhaps best way to get respect on a global scale. The question is simple. What does it hope to achieve with that military respect? That's where the politics of China's military spending come into play, and the answer isn't simple. But we can start with something the US always assumed China wanted to achieve: regional supremacy. In a 2020 article published in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace website, foreign policy experts Jake Sullivan and Hal Brands argued that China has two paths to achieve global domination. The first and most likely path China will take is to build regional supremacy through its military, with that supremacy acting as a foundation for later military efforts. You can see this approach being attempted by Putin and his attempted annexation of Ukraine in 2022. He wants Ukraine because having it gives him and Moscow more territory. By having more territory, Russia would have more places to build bases, station soldiers, and generally act as a threat to those near its borders. China might be preparing to use a similar approach in the Western Pacific. Sullivan and Brand suggest that this is the approach that Western powers assume China is taking. By strengthening its military, it puts itself in a position to seize territory in the Western Pacific, which runs from Japan to the Philippines. With its stronger military and the previously mentioned nukes, dissuading other nations from intervening as it builds power. By taking over countries in the region, China could also potentially destroy relationships that the US has in the region, eroding America's position as China strengthens its own. It seems like a plausible approach to building a global political power. And it should. It is the very approach that the United States has leveraged to become the superpower it is today. We see Russia trying to do it in modern times. Tellingly, almost every major political power in history has taken the approach of strengthening its military to capture territory and become ever more powerful. There are hints that China may follow the same path, at least to some degree. Its People's Liberation Army, or PLA, is rapidly building a presence near Taiwan, with the potential goal of subjugating the island nation entirely. An act that would upend the global political status quo by serving as a direct challenge to the friendly, though unofficial relationship that the US shares with Taiwan. Additionally, China has spent the last few years investing heavily in not just nukes, but quiet submarines, anti-ship missiles, and high-tech air defenses, all ways to warn the US and others that they'll be met with a nasty reception should they encroach on China's current borders or those it might expand to in the future. This country also isn't shy about demonstrating its might to its neighbors that it feels might be a threat, or those that it simply wishes to subjugate. Coming back to the PLA's growing presence near Taiwan, it looks like China is taking a slow squeeze approach to the territory it believes it owns. In fact, reports out of Taiwan indicate that China spent much of 2023 strengthening the military bases it already maintains on the coastline facing Taiwan. A September 2023 report in AP News highlights the scale of this strengthening. Taiwan spotted 20 warships and 22 planes near the island in the space of 24 hours. That military posturing extends to Japan, China's oldest military rival. Japan's Defense Minister Minoru Kihara has already expressed dismay at China's rapid military buildup throughout Asia, going so far as to call Japan's trilateral military exercises with the United States and South Korea the cornerstone of its response to China's actions. For its part, China is making interesting claims about how Japan is taking more offensive approaches to its military, one that suggests China could undermine regional stability. It's gaslighting on a global scale. Those who keep up to date with Asian politics will be familiar with the cycle. China engages in military posturing intended to threaten Taiwan and Japan. When those countries respond by trying to flex their own fighting forces, China not only downplays its own actions, but cleverly suggests that it's Japan and Taiwan that are threatening to disrupt peace in Asia. This approach shows us it's not just military might that'll pave the way to regional dominance for China. This is the second path that Jake Sullivan and Hal Brands mentioned, the more carrot part of the carrot and stick approach. China has more insidious tricks up its sleeve other than its military might, tricks that depend less on direct aggression and more on leveraging political intelligence and jingoistic patriotism to achieve its goals. Take China's President Xi Jinping and his Asia for Asians mantra. On the surface, it seems relatively harmless. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, for instance, has the stated goal of seeing China work together with other Asian nations to massively improve infrastructure. Those efforts are supported by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, which often funds those projects with loans. All seems above board, right? In fact, it sounds like something that could benefit a lot of nations that are poorer than China. But poorer is the operative word here. Those nations don't have the money to complete these infrastructure improvements alone. Instead, they rely on loans from China, with hundreds of them being given out since the BRI initiative started. Study the fine print, and you'll see language that restricts the nations that sign for those loans from seeking additional loans or restructuring from the so-called Paris Club, 22 of the world's biggest creditor nations. You won't be surprised to see the United States is in that club. There are also clauses that give China the ability to demand repayment at any point, whether the nation has the funds or not, potentially leading to some serious debt problems. If you're getting images of mafia loan sharks floating around in your head, you're not too far away from the reality of the situation. But what does all this have to do with the Chinese military? Picture this scene. Country A accepts a loan from China as part of the BRI initiative. That loan covers the construction of a road running through the country, a great trade route, but also a potential transportation route that certain military could use. China knows that, so they ask for repayment when Country A isn't ready to provide it. With no money to pay back the loan, Country A is left indebted to China and in a position where it faces immense pressure from its creditor. It's not beyond the realms of possibility then that China could do something like insist having a military base built in Country A as an alternative form of payment. Suddenly, China has increased its regional power and gained advantageous positioning for its military without spilling a drop of blood. But what about those nations that won't crumble to China's demands for repayment? Well, China now has a reason to use its military to obtain more direct control of an asset that it funded. It's a very clever approach. On one hand, China is building a military and will potentially start claiming territory in the traditional ways that fueled the growth of the US, Russia, and so many nations that came before. But it's backing up that with political maneuvering, taking advantage of its vast wealth to potentially place regional territories in so much debt that they have no choice but to allow Chinese incursion based on little more than a whim. But there is even more. While China is potentially setting up other Asian nations to fall with the BRI project, it's more actively trying to build alliances through military aid donations. Again, this is nothing new. The US, the UK, and several other Western nations are currently donating a lot of money to Ukraine in its fight against Russia, and it's likely the US will provide aid to Israel as its war against Hamas escalates. Additionally, China spends a lot less in this department than the US, according to Rand. According to Rand, China's military aid spending topped out at $560 million between 2013 and 2018, a period in which the United States donated $35 billion. So, small fries from China in the grand scheme of things. But it doesn't change the fact that China's using these donations to curry favor with nations in potentially advantageous positions. With much of its money going toward countries in Asia and Africa, Cambodia is the biggest recipient of China's generosity, having received $115 million in the previously mentioned 2013 to 2018 period. Of course, it's purely coincidental that this aid happened to come at a time when its pro-China Prime Minister at the time, Hun Sen, faced mounting opposition from the more liberal and thus Western-aligned Cambodia National Rescue Party, CNRP. The CNRP was forcefully dissolved in 2018. Hun Sen maintained power and today has essentially passed the baton to his son, Hun Manet, who is maintaining a strong relation with China, and now you see China's military aid strategy in a different light. The country is essentially funding a dictator, one who will act in China's interests if and when the time comes. Building on the aid to Cambodia, China's also donated large amounts of money and equipment to several countries in the African Union, as well as countries like Sri Lanka, Nepal, the Philippines, and Afghanistan. The latter is especially interesting. China has engaged the ruling Taliban party in Afghanistan several times, though this is done more out of necessity than desire. If China had its way, the turmoil that exists in the country would disappear, ideally under the leadership of a party that's sympathetic to China, meaning there'd be less instability on its borders. Right now, it seems happy to appease the Taliban with money, including a $37.4 million donation made in 2022 to quell potential terroristic activity near the China-Afghanistan border. And it's not just money that China's donating, it's weapons. Donating might be too strong a term here, as China is just as likely to sell as it is to simply give weapons to other countries. But it's not above helping nations that align with its political agenda, as we've seen in the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. In April 2023, The Washington Post reported on a set of documents leaked on Discord that showed China had apparently agreed to the provision of lethal aid to Russia, with the documents going on to detail China's plan to disguise this equipment as civilian items, adding a layer of secrecy to its donations. Any doubt that this is happening seemed to disappear the very same month when Reuters reported that Ukrainian fighters were finding more and more Chinese components in captured Russian weapons. All of this points to a country that's willing to use what it has to strengthen ties with potentially useful allies and weaken countries it views as a threat. So there are politics at play behind every military donation China makes. And though the exact nature of those politics varies depending on the nation receiving the money, the end goal is the same. Keep these smaller nations happy with money so they'll be supportive of China's situation. We're even seeing the fruits of some of these donations come to bear. For instance, China has managed to create a military base in Djibouti, located in the Horn of Africa, which gives the country a crucial foothold at a time when it's using the BRI initiative to build more and more infrastructure on the African continent. And according to a report by Air Data, published on The Guardian in July 2023, the US believes China is likely to build more overseas military bases in the future. Gwadar in Pakistan is a likely candidate, as is Bata in Equatorial Guinea, and Hambantota, a Sri Lankan town. The report even emphasizes the investment of China's state-owned banks into several port projects in those regions as evidence of this being a likely outcome. In short, China's using its diplomatic ties to strengthen its global and, most importantly, naval presence, likely aiming to rival the US in terms of its military might stationed overseas. Each base enhances China's foothold in the region, giving it a platform from which the country could conceivably launch attacks. But it hasn't stopped there. China's holding joint naval drills with other countries, such as the drill it performed with Russia and Iran in the Gulf of Oman in March 2023. It shows it's using soft power projection tactics. Yes, those drills serve to strengthen its alliances with the nations with which it holds, but there's also a clear message behind them. We have allies and we're not afraid to work with them. These joint military exercises are also indicators of trust between China and the other countries. Great news for those countries, which get to showcase that they have a powerful military ally. Far more worrying for countries that could be on the other side of the fence should China decide to start the war. Another example comes from China's naval visits to some of the countries it wants to build a stronger tie with. Take the overseas trek to the Republic of Congo in August 2023. China arrived at the Pointe Noire port with an impressive fleet of warships, not to demonstrate dominance over the Congo, but to reinforce its friendship with the nation. These friendship visits are becoming increasingly common, and again China is using them to strengthen political ties while subtly delivering its message to potential opposing forces. We have a lot of friends and we're building our presence in many regions. Now let's change tack. So far we focused on China's militaristic machinations on a global scale, building a stockpile of weapons to bolster its defense, supporting smaller nations with aid to curry their favor for whatever the future might hold, and in a very sneaky move lending money to many countries as a part of a seemingly benevolent project, but only to have that money come with so many strings attached that China need only pull one to leverage its financial muscle and achieve its territorial ambitions. But it's also worth looking closer to home. It's impossible to build a house without creating a solid foundation on which to support it. And it's also impossible for China to strengthen its global political power without a base from which to act. While it's easy to look at China's military expansion from the perspective of what it might do on the global stage, you can't underestimate the important role this renewed military plays closer to home. To China's leaders, especially President Xi Jinping, a powerful military is as much a domestic status symbol as a means to protect China from its enemies or prepare for attacks against them. Having a strong army means being seen as strong on the world stage, but it also means a greater capacity for whipping up patriotic fervor around that strength. And again, this is hardly a new tactic. Millions of people in the United States take great pride in their military, often attending events dedicated to celebrating the men and women who defend their country. Military pride exists. You can see this with the pure vitriol with which many who commit stolen valor, claiming to have served in the military when they haven't, are met with. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that China's leaders are trying to inspire those same feelings of fervent patriotism in their own people, and it's actively using its military to encourage that patriotism. Lavish military parades are a regular sight in Beijing, and many of the country's military exercises, such as its sorties over the Taiwan Strait, are covered extensively by Chinese media. The military is something in which China's people can take pride. By playing up this fact and combining it with rhetoric on the need for defense, given the still recent memories of Japan's attacks on China during the Second World War, the country's leadership cements its position as protectors of an entire nation. That's a great domestic political trump card to have. In essence, Xi Jinping is keeping up appearances to tie militaristic patriotism to himself as a leader. It's no coincidence he's often seen in full military regalia, despite the fact that he has a limited track record of service himself. The constantly growing budget of China's military is a small price to pay for inspiring the loyalty Xi Jinping will need from the country's people should he ever follow through on what many believe is an inevitable display of China's power on the world stage. There's also another factor at play on the domestic level. China as a whole has a desire for global respect, and that desire stems from the many past humiliations the nation has suffered on the military front. Of course, we know about the horrors that China faced in its battles with Japan during World War II, with the Japanese essentially coming out on top in every conflict and only really being stopped by the dropping of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But China's scars run even deeper, stretching all the way back to the 19th century in what historians have dubbed China's century of humiliation. During the 19th century, growing European influence in South and East Asia led to the dismantling of the China-centric power balance in the region. Tellingly, tech lay at the heart of this dismantling. Westerners simply had much better weapons. That increased military power made itself known during the First Opium War, in which China was soundly defeated and forced to cede Hong Kong to the British Empire for reparations. It didn't stop there. The 19th century brought losses from Russia, leading to China losing some of its northern territory, and Japan, with the latter coming out on top during the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895. These constant losses damaged the people's faith in the Qing dynasty, which fell to a revolt in 1911 to pave the way for the establishment of the Republic of China. The point is simple. China spent a century, perhaps even a touch more, taking a beating on the global stage. By flexing its buying power and military might today, the country's leaders are playing on the still present feelings of humiliation that many in China feel while reestablishing the country as a global superpower on the same level it was on before the century of humiliation. So given all this, will China overtake the US and become the new global hegemon? The first and most obvious thing to point out is that China isn't simply set to become the world's next great military superpower. It's already there. It spends more than any other country, barring the US, on its defenses. And if speculation about its purchasing power relative to the US is to be believed, it's getting more bang for its buck with every dollar spent. The result is a military twice the size of the United States, with 2.8 million active members. That, when combined with the country's increasing nuclear power, means that China has a heck of a card to play at the negotiating table. That growing military is already coming into play when we look at China's regional approach. The sorties taking place in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea aren't just mere shows of power. China is demonstrating that it has trained to hold position and take territory in these potential military flashpoints. When combined with the Asia for Asians propaganda, supported by the loans and development work China is delivering to other countries, we see a nation that's taking a multi-pronged approach to securing regional power. If a show of strength alone won't cut it, luring other nations into forming near inescapable financial ties to China creates a situation where these countries are constantly on the precipice of going into debt. This leads to financial weakness, with China being perfectly placed to take advantage, should the time come. Still, we can't deny much of this is speculation. China's global political machinations all point to a country that's both consolidating its position and preparing to expand. But it hasn't engaged in active invasions yet. Instead, it seems to be playing a longer game, ensuring it has all the cards it needs on the table, domestically, regionally, and globally, before it finally reveals the hand it intends to play. One thing is for certain, it'll be interesting to see how China leverages its military might in the coming decade. And that leads us to ask what you think about China's approach. Do you see the country partaking in direct invasions in the near future, bolstered by its strong financial position? Or is China likely to sit back while slowly building its influence until it reaches a point where it becomes a regional superpower through financial muscle backed by its strong military? 3 days before launch, Beijing, China. Military attaché Pan Wei shifted his feet nervously. It wasn't his job to speak his mind. He was just there to help translate political orders into military ones. His direct supervisor was one of a horde of undersecretaries to the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, headed by Chairman Zhao Lei. The only thing special about his supervisor was the access it granted Wei to some of the most senior military advisory boards, a privilege afforded him through family favors and loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. On days like today, he wished he'd said no no to his father when he demanded he join the People's Liberation Army after graduation. He wanted to be a baker, but that would shatter a long and illustrious line of service stretching back to the founding of the party. It would literally break his father's heart, and Wei couldn't stand the shame he felt from his now long-dead ancestors as he considered living a simple, quiet life over service to the party. His great-grandfather had fought in the Civil War that ousted the Nationalists, and his grandfather had briefly partaken in the invasion of Vietnam in the 70s. But those threats paled in comparison to the dangerous path China had set itself upon today. The party already proclaimed victory through every propaganda outlet as logistics for an invasion of Taiwan had been pulled together for the past 8 months. But those amongst the senior-most posts in both the party and the military had their reservations. Wei was among them. Undersecretary Li Kai hung up his phone, motioning at Wei to continue with the briefing that had been interrupted by the emergency phone call. Wei went through the motions, readiness reports, some sabotage to the rail networks outside of Shanghai. That one had gotten the public's attention as a train full of PLA recruits had derailed, killing dozens and injuring hundreds. He wondered if it would be remembered as the first shot in the coming Sino-American War, though he knew it was Taiwanese agents who'd carried out the sabotage. If the war was victorious, the party would simply rewrite history, spin the sabotage not as an act of desperate and preemptive resistance by a nation absolutely dwarfed in military power, but one of the laundry list of imaginary and half-real provocations that they'd invent to justify the invasion of Taiwan and forceful reunification. Wei, speak freely. Forget those nonsense reports. Tell me what's on your mind. Undersecretary Li Kai broke Wei's internal musings. History, sir. History? Wei nodded. On December 4, 1941, a Japanese strike force was just over 1,000 kilometers from Pearl Harbor. Japan was convinced the swift and overwhelming violence would knock the U.S. out of the Pacific. The Americans had no appetite for casualties, they told themselves. Undersecretary Kai steepled his fingers in front of him as he leaned his elbows on his desk. Some would consider your words seditious, Wei, especially on the eve of such a momentous occasion for the party, for China. Wei nodded grimly. I always value your honesty, though, and I'm grateful for it. Unfortunately, far larger forces than us are at work. The board has been set. It's on us to make the first and winning move. Wei searched Undersecretary Kai's face. Did he share Wei's doubts? Even voicing them to a subordinate like him could destroy Kai's political career. The party had eyes and ears across the length and breadth of both the government and the military. Wei'd only spoken up because he'd grown to trust Kai as a good, reasonable man, a little less zealous about the party than most of his compatriots. But did Kai share his doubts? Wei searched the man's face and found nothing. 3 days before launch, 48,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, 112 miles north of Taiwan, U.S. Air Force Captain Les Manahan wheeled the big plane so that the sun was on his port side. The big RC-135 rivet joint aircraft responded nicely to his touch, and somewhere in the back of the aircraft, the electronic warfare and intelligence specialists a big plane housed were poring over the data they'd been collecting since arriving on station minutes ago. Now he put his plane into a racetrack pattern just north of Taiwan, and God willing, that'd be that. But before we follow our pilot any further, we want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Private Internet Access, the world's most transparent VPN provider. Boasting over 30 million downloads, PIA truly stands for user privacy. It hides your IP address and keeps your digital life cloaked, shielding it from prying eyes, whether that's your ISP, network admins, or even the government. Using the internet without PIA is like showering in a room with no door. Everyone can hear your bad singing skills. PIA has also proven its no logs policy in court battles and with an external audit from none other than Deloitte, one of the biggest and most trusted accounting firms in the world. But PIA isn't just about protection, it's also about giving you freedom. Whether you're in Shanghai, London, or New York, it makes all major streaming services accessible, with its servers located in 84 countries and in every US state. Also, PIA VPN is one of the few VPNs that supports P2P file sharing, giving you even more access to content. PIA runs seamlessly across platforms: Windows, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and many others. With a single subscription, you can protect an unlimited number of devices simultaneously. But hold on, it gets even better. We have a special offer for our viewers. Just go to piavpn.com/geopolitico and get an 83% discount on private internet access. And if that didn't convince you yet, subscribing to private internet access is completely risk-free. They have a 30-day money-back guarantee, and if you ever need help, their 24/7 customer support is ready and waiting. So go try private internet access right now. After all, your privacy deserves no less. Now back to the skies above the Pacific Ocean, where an immediate alert from one of his flight officers shattered U.S. Air Force Captain Les Manahan's illusion that today would be a simple, straightforward mission. Manahan sighed. He hadn't expected anything less, but he was hoping maybe, just maybe, this flight could be different. You'd think the Chinese would get tired of wasting jet fuel after months of that particular cat-and-mouse game. The Air Force had been flying its big electronic eavesdroppers all along the Chinese coast since the nation had begun a buildup of its amphibious forces. Just a few hundred miles away, a Japanese AWACS had relieved its American counterpart, and he knew for a fact at least one more rivet joint was flying its own racetrack pattern just off Chinese territorial waters east of Henan. Together, the two aircraft could sniff out all manner of electronic signals for hundreds of miles around them, and their synthetic aperture radar provided accurate location data on Chinese hardware down to a classified resolution. It was very good resolution, though. Manahan knew. He'd flown this particular aircraft on the Black Sea in support of Ukraine, with a Ukrainian liaison on board whose entire job had been to relay a steady stream of information to Ukrainian military command on the vast amounts of intelligence the rivet joint scooped up from Russian-held territory. In a way, Captain Manahan was a fighter ace. At least he considered himself one. He might not have pulled the trigger himself, but it was his aircraft that sniffed out multiple incoming Russian attack aircraft, warning the Ukrainians, who promptly shot them out of the sky. Maybe when they landed back in Okinawa, he'd have one of the maintenance guys stencil some Russian MiGs onto the side of his cockpit. Right now, though, he had other MiGs to worry about, or at least Chinese copies of them. Sure enough, just under a minute later came the call over the open radio channel. American aircraft, you have entered Chinese air identification and defense zone. Turn around immediately and do not return. Well, this guy was more professional than the last two had been, at least, when he'd simply been told to get out or we shoot. Chinese patrol, this is an American aircraft conducting a routine flight in support of lawful freedom of navigation maneuvers over international waters and in international airspace. I request that you continue to operate in a professional conduct and maintain a safe distance from our aircraft. He knew the script by heart after months of these intercepts, though that last part had been tacked on after a Chinese fighter had tried to do a close pass to intimidate the Americans and nearly collided. American aircraft, you have been warned. Exit immediately to safe airspace and leave territory of the People's Republic of China. At least the Chinese pilot sounded as bored as he did, so Manahan was pretty sure he wouldn't get shot down today. He repeated his script once more, making it clear for anyone listening and taking notes that his plane was in fact operating in international airspace. At least if he did get shot down, there'd be a recording somewhere showing that it was the Chinese who shot first. He hoped that they'd edit the screams of him and his crew plummeting to their deaths out of it, though. Manahan knew that somewhere out there was either a flight of Raptors or F-35s, but without speaking to the geeks in the back, he had no idea if they were in range to help. Besides, the Chinese still had a longer reach in the sky thanks to their PL-15 air-to-air missiles, outranging the US by about 24 or so miles. They could very well shoot the Chinese fighters down, but Manahan would still bite the bullet. The Chinese did not, in fact, shoot though. Instead, they fell into a mirror patrol about 50 miles off his port. Unless they were ready to shoot, there was really nothing the Chinese could do to stop the world's best electronic intelligence spy plane. The rivet joint used a whole host of systems to scoop up vast amounts of information from the busy Chinese coast. Even at this distance, it'd be able to listen in on radio transmissions and allegedly cell phone calls placed by Chinese soldiers and sailors. He wasn't completely sure of his plane's own full capabilities. The United States kept its secrets very close to its chest, and just because it trusted him to bust their techies around didn't mean it trusted him enough to tell him how his own plane really worked. All he really knew was that he'd rather be flying back over the Black Sea, where the risk of direct U.S. involvement was minimal. Here, in the Pacific, everyone knew what was coming. 10 hours later, Captain Manahan turned his plane for home, only to get redirected to a waiting tanker. He wouldn't be landing on Okinawa after all. Instead, he'd be going to the Japanese mainland. If he was a betting man, he'd bet that it'd only be a quick refueling stop before going even further east, toward Konus, just like the hundreds of other American aircraft and ships had been doing over the last 2 weeks. That meant only one thing. Someone, somewhere, had figured out that the shooting was about to start. 2 days before launch, Sea of Japan, 172 miles north of JMSDF, Maizuru Air Base. I'm telling you, it's a dead whale! Matsumoto Hiroshi shouted at his curious partner from the wheelhouse of the small 60-foot fishing vessel. On the front deck, Okano Toshiaki and 2 other crew shone flashlights into the early morning darkness of the sea. No, it's different. It's there, straight ahead. Go slow. Okano shouted excitedly, pointing dead ahead. Sure enough, Matsumoto could see what the much younger Okano's sharp eyes had spotted 10 minutes ago. Visible, as it crested on the ocean swells and caught the moonlight, was a large dark shape seemingly bobbing around the surface. I'm warning you, it's a whale carcass. You don't want to get too close to that thing. Full of gas, it can explode. Okano waved off his captain's warning. "It's not a whale. I think it's salvage." Matsumoto silenced the continued warning he was about to issue. Salvage. Now that was interesting, and potentially worth something. Fishing these days hadn't been what it used to be, with fish stocks collapsing in the Sea of Japan. If he was lucky, maybe it'd be military, something the Japanese Self-Defense Maritime Force had accidentally dropped off the back of a ship, maybe. "Go a little starboard. A little more. There. Slow and stop. Keep us here." The small fishing boat pulled up alongside something. It was dark, deep blue metal, oblong-shaped, bobbing along the surface. On the back of it was a small propeller. Matsumoto felt alarm shoot through his body. "Hey, Okano, I'm pulling us away. It's a North Korean submarine." Matsumoto was almost pushing the throttle forward when Okano's next words stopped him. "No, don't be stupid. We're too far from North Korea for such a small submarine. I think it's a drone." "Hey, young one, you remember to speak to your elders with respect." But Matsumoto's warning was lost on the impulsive Okano. He was already hooking a large spiked pole to a small purchase point he spotted on the hull of the strange craft. Whatever annoyance he felt that the young fisherman was quickly lost. He was a good boy, just a bit wild like most of the children of his generation. And besides, if this really was a drone, it was probably American, and they might be willing to compensate them richly for its recovery. Over the course of a few minutes, Okano and the two deckhands managed to secure the large drone to the side of the boat. It was just under half as long as their own vessel, oblong with a rounded nose and a single small propeller in the rear. The sea was calm enough that Okano could actually hop onto the top of it to take a closer look. From the wheelhouse, Matsumoto yelled out fresh warnings. "Hey, you be careful, and don't damage anything or fall overboard. I don't want to get it from your mother." Okano waved off the old man as usual. "Relax, Grandpa, I'm just taking a look. There's a panel here, I think. Maybe I can open it." He tried to open what appeared to be a rather large access panel, but it wouldn't budge, so he called out to the deckhands to bring him the large flathead screwdriver that they kept in the tool locker to work on the ship's old motor. "Don't damage it. Maybe the Americans will pay us for their drone, but not if you break it." But Okano was too busy working at the panel to listen to the old captain, inserting the flathead into the small space between the hull of the drone and the access door. He started pushing with all his might. "I think it's giving. Maybe there's writing. We can find out who it—" 2 days before launch. Joint Base Pearl Harbor, Hickam, Hawaii, Pacific Fleet Headquarters. There was one single knock on the frame of the door to Commander Mason Evans' office, interrupting the commander's meeting with 2 junior officers. Evan could see from the look on the lieutenant's face that he was on important business. The young lieutenant had just been assigned to Pac Fleet HQ and had the nervous energy of a very small fish in a very large pond full of even bigger fish. "Go ahead," Commander Evan ordered, but the lieutenant shuffled uncomfortably for a moment before brandishing a carefully folded paper. "Eyes only, sir." The 2 subordinates didn't need any further prompting. They swiftly stood and bid the commander goodbye as he motioned the lieutenant into his office, taking the paper from the nervous young man. Usually, he'd get any important news over a secure landline. He found this whole return-to-hand-delivered messages archaic. But the Chinese had proven to be adept at infiltrating the Navy's communication network. And while he was pretty confident in the ComSec of Pac Fleet HQ, he had to admit it was a good policy to limit risk. He opened the folded paper and read it once, then read it again. Then he folded it again and fed it to a small box within arm's reach of his desk. The box whirred as it fed itself the paper and gave off a slight hum as the paper was promptly incinerated. "Did you read it?" "No, of course not, but I was there when it came in. I know what's on it, sir. Remember ComSec. Don't go about changing your plans all of a sudden, but you can probably guess you shouldn't be making any big plans for the weekend." The lieutenant nodded. Dismissed. With a smart-about face, the lieutenant turned and exited the office, closing the door behind him by habit. Commander Evans was quick out the door himself, though, nodding past his secretary, who'd ensured the office door locked electronically behind him. He found Rear Admiral Coriolis in the dining facility, arriving just as Captain Sage Hensley, head of Pac Fleet Intelligence, made her own appearance. Deputy Commander of the United States Pacific Fleet Coriolis was having lunch with a group of enlisted personnel as he usually did, much to the delight of the sailors and airmen. It was a great morale boost to rub shoulders with the second in charge, made you feel seen, but it could also be nerve-wracking experiences for some of the fresh recruits. Admiral Ellis spotted his 2 subordinates swiftly moving his way and dismissed his breakfast group, leaving the table empty as Evan and Captain Hensley arrived to sit. "Well, nobody's called me on my cell phone, so I know the war hasn't started yet." The Admiral was savoring the last of a fat-free strawberry yogurt. Why was the modern Navy at war with all fat, he mused. Evan could hardly tell Hensley was slightly annoyed he'd beat her to the Admiral. She was one of the most cutthroat officers he'd ever met and cherished all the face time she could get with those immediately responsible for her next promotion. But she was also incredibly efficient. Evan was grateful she was on his side of this potential war. Japanese fishing vessel sunk just north of Maizuru. Its captain got off a distress call before the ship went under. Search and rescue still underway, but it's been a few hours. Prospects not good. At the mention of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force base, the admiral's eyebrows shot up. The two had his complete and full attention. Captain Hensley edged in. Our JMSDF partners relayed that before losing contact, the captain said they'd recovered a large object. Space Force confirmed thermal event approximately 147 nauticals north of Maizuru. We clued the Japanese in on the location. The admiral licked his spoon clean. Could it be a mine? Evan let Hensley take the lead. If there were Chinese mines being deployed in the Sea of Japan, she'd be the one to know. Negative. We had Chinese boats on the hydros. The Montana's been on look-and-see duty and found nothing that their tails missed so far, though they'd be unlikely to. Neither Evan nor Hensley were old enough to remember the Cold War Navy, but Ellis had been a young ensign back then toward the end, and his father had been a submariner before him. He used to regale him with stories of tailing Soviet subs for weeks on end, the Ruskies clueless to the 360 feet of silent death lurking just a few hundred meters behind them. The Chinese were proving similarly easy to track for America's new Virginia class, but were making frightful progress, mostly by stealing NATO tech secrets. Suggestions on what it could have been? Likely a suicide drone. I'm guessing the boat either ran into it, it malfunctioned, or it was compromised by the crew somehow. We don't know unless the Japanese can get to the survivors, and that's unlikely. Evan could swear he saw the professional mask Hensley wore 24/7 slip for just a moment. All intelligence types wore their masks. It was their job to deliver and safeguard information that could win or lose wars, but hers had slipped. What had he seen underneath though? Fear? Apprehension? Anticipation? He wasn't sure. The admiral nodded. I'll notify the old man. Needless to say, I would advise your staff to not make any weekend plans. If China was truly deploying suicide drones that close to Japanese naval bases, then the war was almost on. And in a way, that was a relief. After nearly a year of build-up, negotiations, counter-negotiations, posturing, and preparing, it was happening. There would only be one victor, because neither side could afford a compromise. For both the US and China, it was all on the line. If China failed in its invasion of Taiwan or was defeated by the United States, the Chinese Communist Party would surely fall. If the United States was defeated, it would be pushed out of the West Pacific for the foreseeable future, maybe forever completely upending the global status quo. This one was for all the marbles. Commander Evans should have been afraid, but instead he was just damn relieved that the insufferable wait was finally over. 18 hours before launch, National Reconnaissance Office HQ, Chantilly, Virginia. A group of technicians huddled over a large LCD display set into a table in the middle of the imaging analysis lab, buried deep in the basement of the NRO's sprawling HQ. From here, imaging data from a fleet of orbiting satellites was fed to over 100 technicians who used advanced AI algorithms to pore over the millions of images generated every day and look for the tiniest discrepancies between each. It was similar to the way that astronomers looked for new planets or large comets in the early days, poring over dozens of photographic plates to look for the transient dots of light that might only move millimeters from plate to plate. But the NRO's AI algorithms were tracking ships, airplanes, sometimes even individual vehicles. It was a painstaking job that used to take dozens of man-hours to accomplish, and even then could never achieve the speed and precision that AI made possible. Now the display showed a military airfield in Anqing in southwest Anhui province, but no AI algorithm was needed to spot the difference between the photos snapped by orbiting reconnaissance satellites just 6 hours apart. All 24 of the airbase's H-6 bombers were missing. In an incredible feat of logistics, the Chinese had managed to fuel and presumably arm 24 intercontinental bombers and launch them before the next overflight of an American spy satellite. The call had already been made to the U.S. National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. 8 hours before launch, 10 miles offshore Agatu Island. Duan Jingguo eyed the men working the research vessel's crane warily. He distrusted them, but especially the one in charge, the big, muscle-bound man who'd spoke maybe 5 words the entire time they'd been on the ship. It was clear they were government men, doing a very bad job of pretending to be research scientists like the rest of Jingguo and his crew. Jingguo had no choice but to accept the men on board. The government had funded his study of the Arctic beluga whale population that frequently transited through the Alaskan Aleutian Islands, where they found themselves currently. The funding had been a surprise to Jingguo, not least of all because the study was being conducted in cooperation with American biologists. China and the US had little reason to collaborate nowadays. The 3 obvious government men and their mysterious payload, now being craned out over the side of the ship, had not been a part of the deal. He wasn't surprised. The military frequently funded endeavors such as this that it considered dual use or of scientific and national defense value. But beluga whales? Now he knew. They just needed a way to get close to the American Aleutian Islands to drop off this whatever it was. Jingguo frowned. He didn't like this cloak and dagger stuff. He disliked the tensions between his nation and America, which made his working relationship with American biologists on board strained even more. He just wanted to study his whales. The senior government man cursed as the crane swung its payload back in toward the ship as a particularly high wave struck it. The big black box was about 4 meters long, maybe a meter wide and a meter thick. It had been stashed on the rear deck of the ship for the entire voyage, and everyone had been under strict instructions not to tamper with it. Jingguo had been forced to make up a story to the 3 American scientists about their current diversion. The plan had been to try to catch up with the beluga pods moving through the Aleutian chain, and the ship had been given clearance by the U.S. government, though upon arriving in their territorial waters, a U.S. Coast Guard cutter had been an ever-present companion. Given the tensions between the two nations, Jingguo wasn't surprised. At least if the ship ran into trouble, help wouldn't be too far away. And speaking of the Americans, where in the world were those 3 biologists? With a final stream of profanities, the government goons finally managed to move their payload into position just over the water's edge. The rear crane was disengaged, allowing one end of the strange box to fall into the sea. Almost immediately, the top end, still secured by its own crane, deployed a series of airbags. Jingguo raised an eyebrow. He presumed they were meant to be sinking what he thought must be some sort of secret underwater sensor or something. But this was meant to float? The front crane disengaged and the box fell into the sea, bobbing up and down as its top end remained above the waves. The government man, the big one in charge, immediately yelled for everyone to get away from the side of the ship. Watching from his perch outside the main cabin on the upper deck, Jingguo was bemused. What in the world? What? Then there was a loud hiss, followed by a metallic pop and twin simultaneous roars as 2 columns of flames shot up into the sky. Mouth agape, Jingguo followed the fiery path of what he couldn't know was a specially modified land attack cruise missile. The specially modified CJ-10s had been significantly reduced in weight and length, given that they only needed to travel about 3 dozen miles to their target. This also allowed them to be secretly inside a metal deployment box and stored aboard a ship without raising the suspicion a full-size 7+ meter missile might. 3,000 feet into the sky, the missiles engaged their seekers and then immediately plummeted to just 24 feet off the waves. The maneuver was meant to help them evade air defenses, but it was completely unnecessary. The Americans had no deployed ground-based air defenses at the target site. Locking onto the powerful emissions of the massive L-band phased array radar situated at Erickson Air Station on an island 30 miles away, the missiles screamed over the waves, crossing the distance in about a minute and a half. They both struck the massive radar array, missing center mass by about half a meter, one immediately after the other. Each 600-pound warhead was more than enough to destroy the target. But the Chinese military wasn't taking any chances. Back on the ship, Jingguo had been tracking the smoky flight path of the missiles in the chilling near-zero air, then gasped at the telltale flash of twin explosions in the far distance illuminating off the low-hanging cloud cover. By instinct, he turned to swing his binoculars around on the American Coast Guard cutter about 3 miles off their starboard, settling on the big 57mm cannon on the front of the ship. The burly government man grunted as he made his way up the stepladder to the ship's upper deck, then briskly addressed the stunned Jingguo as he removed his cell phone from his pocket, snapped it in 2, and threw it overboard. Contact the American ship and surrender before they blow us to pieces. Also, you might want to release the Americans from their restraints before you do. You'll find them locked in their berths. 2 hours before launch, Beijing, China. Pan Wei exited on the rooftop of the government building, spotting the undersecretary sitting on a chair next to what appeared to be a folding table next to him. Li Kai beckoned him over, motioning at a second chair. Kai offered him a beer from the cooler seated atop the table. Wei hesitated. It was late, but technically he was still on duty. Technically, both he and the undersecretary were still on duty. As if reading his mind, Undersecretary Kai waved off his concerns. "Come, sit, have a beer." Wei sat, reaching for a beer but holding it uncomfortably without opening it. Kai reached over and opened it for him, pressing it back into the man's hands. "It's okay, our duty's done. Everything that happens from here, well, we've done our job." Slowly, Wei sipped the beer. It tasted like ash in his mouth, but he didn't say anything. "We're lucky it's a clear sky tonight, almost no smog. Can you believe it, in Beijing?" The undersecretary laughed. A casual glance at the floor next to his feet revealed that this was in fact not his first beer, nor his second. "Sir, do you think—" "Shh, hush now. No more thinking. Any minute now. I spoke to a Plarf major. He assured me we'd see at least some of the launches from the batteries in Zhang Bay if the skies were clear. Quite the light show, he promised." On cue, a column of light appeared in the distant horizon, then another and another, then a dozen more. The fiery plumes reached up into the skies, filling the unusually clear night with massive plumes of smoke which refracted the light. There were so many of them that it was almost like a miniature sunrise. "Look, my boy, watch. The heavens announced the end of our century of humiliation," Undersecretary Kai exclaimed loudly. drunkenly. Wei sat in silence, watching until the last of the fiery plumes faded. The undersecretary mirrored his silence, then angrily tossed his half-full beer can over the side of the building. 35 minutes before launch, 30,000 feet above the Pacific, 618 miles northwest of Hawaii. The E-2C swung north to expand its patrol pattern to better match the evasive maneuvers being undertaken by the USS Nimitz 100 miles southeast of their position. The big carrier was at full military power and easily outrunning its escorts, putting on an astonishing burst of speed to make it a much harder target for the Chinese ballistic missile barrage that had already laid waste to so many Pacific Fleet ships. 2 of the Nimitz's escorts had already been sunk, another was dead in the water. The Navy had been forced to choose between rescue efforts or keeping its fleet moving to make them harder for the Chinese missiles to find them as they pounced down from space. It had opted to keep its surviving ships moving. The E-2 aircraft was on its own mission, though, and its radar operator had his eyes glued on his display. The surprise attack on the Erickson radar array had created a massive gap in the U.S.'s radar coverage of the Pacific, and it didn't take a genius to figure out what was coming next. Taking out Erickson had created a gap through the Aleutian corridor, but the Chinese hadn't struck at any of the mainland Alaskan or Canadian radars. That meant only one thing. They didn't want the Americans to see what was coming south through the Aleutians, and if you went south far enough from the Aleutians, well, that only left Hawaii, home to the U.S. Navy and Air Force's most important Pacific bases. The 24 missing H-6 bombers now made sense to U.S. intelligence. The Chinese had clearly flown them north with permission from Russia, refueling over Russian territory before swinging southeast, timing their entry into range of Erickson array just after its destruction. Now the Nimitz had dual duty: evade the ongoing Chinese ballistic missile barrage and try to plug the massive hole torn open in North Pacific radar coverage. The latter was impossible, but its E-2s could at least cover the most likely northern approach to Hawaii. A half hour later, the radar operator spotted the returns that could only come from the big Chinese bombers. Bogey, heading 342, Angels 41, make that 3. Nope, that's it, we got him. Range 361 miles, making 641 knots. The air traffic controller didn't wait for confirmation. She was already on the radio with the loitering cap. Flight Viper, be aware, bogeys on bearing 042 from your position, range 421 nauticals. The Nimitz had put up 3 combat air patrols. All 3 just happened to be in the wrong position. But F-18s were fast when they wanted to be, and fuel was no concern. On his plot, the radar operator could already see Viper flight wheeling and turning on a heading to the incoming Chinese bombers. The 2-ship flight quickly accelerated to 1,200 miles per hour as the other 2 caps wheeled on the Chinese as well. The Super Hornets were in full murder configuration, and within minutes more would join them from the carrier, each carrying 10 AIM-120s, but the air-to-air missiles had a range of just about 87 nautical miles. Armed with the new generation air-to-ground cruise missiles, the Chinese H-6s only needed to get within 500 nautical miles of Hawaii to launch their ordnance. It's unlikely many of the bombers would make it home, but it was just as unlikely the American aircraft would take out more than half the flight before they released their deadly payloads. Hawaii would suffer a second Pearl Harbor, just as devastating as the first. Suddenly, in the distant horizon, there was a bright flash of light. The crew of the E-2 shielded their eyes as the light penetrated even deep into the belly of the plane from the front windows, as a wave of electronic noise smashed into the aircraft's sensitive gear, and briefly all their displays went haywire. But the E-2 had been built for a nuclear battlefield, and within moments the technicians were back in control. Viper flight hadn't been so lucky. Their assigned patrol route had been along the very eastern patrol edge of the Nimitz's ever-shifting position as the aircraft carrier sped along. This put them about 430 miles northwest of Hawaii and at the very edge of the nuclear explosion. 1 hour after launch, White House. There was a rare break in the hectic noise and activity of the Underground Operations Center. From here, the President of the United States had monitored the ongoing war in the Pacific, now about 19 hours old, in as real time as the U.S. military's communication networks could manage. Under constant electronic attack and with a great deal of Pacific infrastructure destroyed on the ground by Chinese missiles, there were significant blank spots in the U.S. military's awareness. The Space Force Major was keenly aware of the 24 eyes now resting on him, including the wartime leader of the free world. Mr. President, the Chinese seem to be targeting all of our orbital assets except our space-based surveillance network. There have been no further launches from known nuclear complexes inside mainland China. I believe, Mr. President, that the Chinese are sending a message by leaving our early warning satellites untouched. They're not wishing to escalate to a nuclear exchange. The Secretary of Defense growled into his coffee as a goddamned warning, a message: stay out of the Pacific, out of Taiwan or else. The Secretary of the Navy leaned in toward the President, a murderous look in her eyes. Mr. President, with all due respect, this nation has never responded to nuclear blackmail, and this was not a victimless display of resolve. They nuked 2 of my aviators, along with thousands of sailors and airmen already dead across the Pacific. She quivered in barely restrained rage. The look on the face of the Secretary of the Air Force mirrored her fierce anger, though his face remained set in stony silence. The President of the United States leaned forward in his chair. I want my Air Force back in the Pacific. Let me know as soon as Okinawa and the Japanese can launch planes. I want ships being sunk in the strait within 72 hours. The last war that China won was the Xinhai Revolution, and the only reason it was victorious was because China was fighting against itself. It's this war that led to the founding of the People's Republic of China that exists today. However, if we go back in time, the Chinese military rarely fared well in armed conflicts against foreign powers. And a lot of mistakes have been made by Chinese soldiers, generals, and leaders. We're going to take a look at some of the worst Chinese military mistakes in history. However, its biggest shortcoming might not be what you think. We're going to take you on a journey through China's past military blunders in the order in which they happened. In some of these wars, China fared worse than others, but the common thread is that the Chinese military lost each one, and there were devastating consequences for the Chinese people as a result. The failure to conquer territory in some situations and protect the homeland in others has led to China losing battles and wars that could have been won with a little more strategic planning. The First Opium War. The Opium Wars were a result of Chinese leadership trying desperately to stop the opium trade within its borders. Unfortunately for China, opium was extremely popular in Europe and was the largest export to Asia for countries like Britain and France at the time. By 1820, much of the population in China was either using or involved with opium in some way. The widespread addiction and connection to the drug led to the Chinese government cracking down on the opium trade, and in the spring of 1839, 20,000 chests of the drug were destroyed or confiscated by the government at a British warehouse in Guangzhou. Around 1,400 tons of opium were destroyed, unsurprisingly angering the Brits who were hoping to sell it for a hefty profit. Around this time, the First Opium War began, and China made some serious military mistakes that would cost them the war and lead to the deaths of thousands of Chinese soldiers and civilians. The following year, in 1840, British forces defeated China's Qing military in a series of campaigns. This was because Qing forces were not properly equipped or prepared to go up against the British. Throwing Chinese troops at an enemy force would be a common thread in military mistakes made by the Chinese over the coming decades. Knowing that the British had the most formidable navy in the world, China's leaders should have focused on protecting major waterways and ports. However, Beijing seemed to let the British command major channels and rivers without putting up much of a fight. Unfortunately for China, it didn't have the ships or the technology to stand up against the British Navy, and its ground soldiers were useless in naval battles. As the war progressed, the British Navy destroyed the Chinese blockade along the estuary where the Pearl River, now known as the Zhujiang, empties into the South China Sea near Hong Kong. The British fleet traveled up the river to Guangzhou, where they attacked and eventually occupied the city in May 1841. The British continued to win victory after victory as the Qing military struggled to keep the invading force at bay. The Chinese soldiers were dedicated and gave their lives to protect their homeland, but they were not as well trained or as well equipped as the British. The Qing leadership knew this, but continued to throw its soldiers at the British in hopes that they would somehow push the enemy out of their borders. This was a mistake that would cost the Chinese government and its people in the end. A hasty counterattack was launched by the Chinese troops in the spring of 1842, but the British held their ground and used the opportunity to take the culturally and economically significant city of Nanjing. This led the Chinese leadership to seek peace, resulting in the Treaty of Nanjing. China was forced to pay Britain for the losses it sustained while also surrendering Hong Kong to British control. The number of ports that Britain could trade with increased from 1 to 5, and since the British won, opium would once again flow between China and Europe. The First Opium War was a huge military failure for China, eventually leading to Britain wanting more influence in the region. To understand just how badly the First Opium War went for China, we can look at some key statistics. Around 20,000 British troops and allies were sent to China to fight. The Qing military consisted of approximately 200,000 troops, half of which were mobilized for the war. In hindsight, the Qing leadership should have probably utilized more of their forces to push the British out of their territory. It's estimated that the British forces sustained around 800 casualties, of which only about 70 died in battle. China, on the other hand, lost 3,100 men and 4,000 others were injured. These numbers clearly show that the Chinese military was out of their depth and some significant changes needed to be made to the tactics they used. The Second Opium War. Unfortunately for China, their military wouldn't fare much better in the Second Opium War. Before this war even kicked off, due to a series of unfortunate events, the Qing government had to contend with a rebellion. In 1851, a man by the name of Hong Juquan declared himself the brother of Jesus Christ and started his own brand of religion known as Taiping Christianity. Juquan started a revolution in southern China by uniting ethnic minority groups who felt overtaxed and oppressed by the Qing rulers. The Taiping Rebellion began in January in the southern province of Guangxi. An army of 10,000 men led by Fang Yunshuan and Wei Changhui attacked Qing forces in Jintian, in present-day Guiping, Guangxi. The rebel army surprised the Qing forces, known as the Green Standard Army, and pushed them out of the region. When Qing units tried to launch a counterattack, it was successfully repelled by the Taiping army. With every battle its troops won, the Heavenly Kingdom's message spread and more people joined the Taiping Rebellion. The British saw the distracted Qing military as being even weaker than before and used the rebellion to further expand its influence in the region. Britain once again renewed hostilities against the Chinese, and the Qing leadership found itself fighting two wars simultaneously. Their first mistake in this conflict was treating ethnic minorities as lower-class citizens and subjugating populations throughout southern China. However, if the Qing leadership had not conceded so much to the British after the First Opium War, giving them a taste of future riches that could be pulled from the Chinese territory, perhaps the British wouldn't have almost immediately jumped at the chance to attack when the Qing military was focused elsewhere. Regardless, the Second Opium War would be another military blunder by the ruling Qing dynasty. In October of 1856, the British once again sailed up the Pearl River and sieged Canton. When the British couldn't break the stalemate between its forces and the Chinese, they collaborated with the French to bolster their numbers. Once France joined the fight, it was only a matter of time before Canton fell, which happened in 1857. The Europeans deposed the leadership and installed officials who were more sympathetic to their cause. Eventually, the British and French forces reached Tianjin, and the Qing were once again forced to enter negotiations that would not go in their favor. New ports were opened to European traders and residences in Beijing were given to foreign envoys. However, the biggest win for the Europeans and a huge blow to the Chinese leadership is that by the end of the Second Opium War, the drug would become formally legalized. This gave European traders easier access to the product that was making them so much money. Although it's almost always a mistake to fight two wars simultaneously, the Qing had very little choice in the matter. The Taiping Rebellion would have torn the country apart, and the encroachment by European powers would not be stopped due to the lucrative opium trade. The Second Opium War resulted in around 2,500 casualties for the Chinese and approximately 700 casualties on the European side. However, the Taiping Rebellion cost the lives of between 20 and 30 million people. Some scholars even suggest that as many as 100 million civilians and soldiers may have died during the Civil War due to famine, disease, and fighting. The Sino-French War. Just over 2 decades after the carnage of the Second Opium War and Taiping Rebellion, the Chinese military once again found themselves at war with a familiar foe. But before we find out who they went to war with next, first we want to thank the sponsor of today's video, War Thunder. Are you looking for the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made? Then you have to check out War Thunder. In War Thunder, you get to take command of over 2,000 vehicles, from tanks and planes to helicopters and ships that span over a century of development, from the 1920s all the way to modern day. And each is modeled down to their smallest details to make the most realistic and immersive combat experience ever. And War Thunder has one of the most in-depth customization systems for vehicles out there, allowing you to apply literally hundreds of different camouflages, historical markings, and 3D decorations that you can apply anywhere on your equipment to truly make each vehicle your own. I loved seeing my own highly customized tank rolling across the battlefield in beautiful 4K resolution. But my favorite part was watching others take actual damage to their vehicle components and crew with War Thunder's Damage X-Ray. So what are you waiting for? Play War Thunder for free right now on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox by using my link in the video description, which gets new players on any platform a large bonus pack that includes multiple premium vehicles, an exclusive 3D decorator, and more, but only for a limited time. Now, as we were saying, just over 2 decades after the carnage of the Second Opium War and the Taiping Rebellion, the Chinese military once again found themselves at war with a familiar foe. The Sino-French War broke out when France began encroaching on the Vietnam territory that China had previously laid claim to. For years, the Vietnamese people had suffered under Chinese oppression and empty promises of modernization. This led to a nationalization movement across the country. So when France promised European infrastructure as well as access to more resources through trade and mild colonization, it seemed like a better deal for the Vietnamese leadership. By 1880, French troops had reached the borders of Chinese-held Vietnam, known as Cochin China. France had been able to defeat Chinese forces in the past alongside the British in the Second Opium War, and it was clear that the Chinese military had continuously made the same mistake of overextending itself. So French leadership concluded that the Chinese military was only a small barrier to overcome in order to secure Vietnam. This led to the French pushing further north and moving troops into Hanoi and Haiphong. China tried to be strategic in its response, but like in the past, things didn't always go their way, and thousands of Chinese soldiers would die. The Sino-French War was another military defeat in just over half a century. Between 25,000 and 35,000 Chinese troops were sent to Vietnam to protect the territory, but did very little to push France out of the region. In 1882, the great Chinese statesman Li Hongzhang tried to negotiate an agreement to turn Vietnam into a joint protectorate of France and China. However, when French leadership received the proposal, they immediately rejected it and responded by deploying more troops to the area. The Chinese government became overrun by war parties advocating for China to take a more aggressive stance in Vietnam, a decision that would end in tragedy. As more and more reinforcements were sent to the south, France leveraged their superior weapons and technology to fend off wave after wave of Chinese soldiers. Li Hongzhang created a new contract called the Li Fournier Agreement that would allow France to trade throughout the Tonkin region. China would also withdraw its troops from Vietnam in exchange for not having to pay indemnities. However, many in the Chinese government still wanted war, and for China to remain the dominant power in the region. This constant push to go to war was a huge error. General Zhang Zhidong took command of Chinese forces in Vietnam and enjoyed initial success in his campaigns to the south. However, when the new Chinese fleet of 11 steamers reached the coast of Vietnam, the French quickly destroyed them. In 1885, the Chinese military suffered several major defeats, solidifying the fact that the war parties in Beijing had made a terrible mistake. At the Battle of Ho Mok, the French 1st Brigade of the Tonkin Expeditionary Corps defeated Black Flag and Yunnan Army's forces. This prevented Chinese soldiers from reaching the French outpost at Tuyen Quang, which could have been a turning point in the war. When the siege was finally called off and the Chinese forces retreated to the west, around 76 French soldiers had been killed, with Chinese casualties much higher. The Sino-French War ended when a peace treaty was signed in Paris in 1885. China agreed to recognize the Li Fournier Agreement and provided France with trade opportunities throughout much of Vietnam. China was also forced to remove its armies from the region. The First Sino-Japanese War. The 1800s was a rough century for the Chinese military. It seemed as if the country was constantly at war with either colonial powers or other powers in Asia. In 1894, conflict erupted between Japan and China. Japan had been looking to modernize and simulate the success of European colonization. They had their sights set on mainland Asia and believed China was not nearly as powerful as they claimed, which turned out to be true. Civil unrest, poor leadership, and constant war had taken a toll on China. This spelt bad news for Korea, one of China's most important tributary territories, as it contained a vast amount of coal and iron that was vital to modernizing the region. Japan knew Korea could also serve as a staging ground for future invasions from the mainland to their islands. If Japan was to continue to grow its power and influence, it needed to expand its borders, and Korea's location and natural resources made it the perfect territory to colonize. In 1875, Japan began influencing politics in Korea to allow for more lucrative trade opportunities. Tokyo then began to support radical forces within the Korean government that wanted to push the country toward modernization, while the Chinese backed the conservative officials who were more closely aligned with their own desires. Things started to go from bad to worse when pro-Japanese reformers tried to overthrow the Korean government in 1884. This led to China sending in troops led by General Yuan Shikai to rescue the Korean king, but resulted in the deaths of several Japanese legation guards. War was narrowly avoided and things in Korea remained relatively stable for a decade. Then in 1894, while Japan's modernization program was in full swing, China assassinated a pro-Japanese revolutionary vying for power in the Korean government. This enraged the Japanese leadership. When the Tonghak Rebellion broke out in Korea and China sent troops to squash the rebellion, Japan responded by sending 8,000 of their own soldiers. Japan also managed to sink the British steamer Koshing carrying China's reinforcements. This attack only heightened the tensions between the two nations. On August 1, 1894, war between Japan and China officially was declared. Many believed that since China had a much larger military, it would be able to secure an easy victory. However, like the mistakes in the past, China relied too heavily on numbers and not enough on sound tactics. China did not take into consideration how rapidly Japan had modernized. Having better equipment, ships, and weapons, Japan began to win overwhelming naval and land victories, shocking the Chinese leadership and the rest of the world. The Japanese quickly defeated Chinese forces at the Battle of Pungdo, Battle of Songwan, and the Battle of Pyongyang, where approximately 2,000 Chinese soldiers were killed, while Japan only lost around 150 men. At the Battle of the Yalu River, 12 Japanese ships defeated 14 Chinese vessels. China suffered another 1,350 casualties, while Japan's losses were closer to 380 troops. Chinese forces didn't fare much better as the fighting continued into the next year. At the Battle of Weihai Wei, Qing forces lost 4,000 men, had 1 battleship captured, and another scuttled. China also had 6 torpedo boats destroyed and another 7 captured in this single battle. The Battle of Yingqiu led to the end of major combat during the First Sino-Japanese War. 55,800 Japanese troops and over 100 artillery guns were used to attack the bulk of Chinese forces, which numbered between 40,000 and 60,000. Additionally, 5,700 Chinese soldiers were killed, with another 6,000 being taken captive by the Japanese. During the battle, the Japanese lost less than 1,000 men. It was a total and utter defeat for the Chinese military. They had greatly underestimated their enemy, which was evidently a big mistake. The same tactic of relying on superior numbers rather than sound military strategy and modernization once again cost China the war. With so much success in Korea, Japan decided to take the fight to China. By March of 1895, Japan had invaded Shandong province and Manchuria. The Japanese Navy and ground forces were quickly approaching Beijing. China sued for peace, and the Treaty of Shimonoseki was ratified, which ended the war. China was forced to pay indemnity and give Japan trading rights within Chinese territory. The tragic part for China was that it had yet to win a major conflict during the 19th century, which led Western powers to seek even more concessions from the nation, as there was nothing they could do about it. The Chinese military was weak even if it had superior numbers. The century-long defeat of Chinese forces led to reform within the country as revolutionary activity against the Qing dynasty began. The Second Sino-Japanese War. While the Western world recovered from the horrors of the First World War, another conflict began to brew between Japan and China. Japan continued to modernize and spread its influence in Asia throughout the early 20th century. China was rightfully concerned by this and looked to resist Japanese expansionist policies. For most of the early 1900s, Japan maintained control of Manchuria. A significant part of the Manchurian population was recognized as being Chinese, even though most were actually of Manchu descent. And in order to gain sovereignty over its own territory, China began to take a more aggressive stance against the Japanese colonial practices. Between 1931 and 1932, Japan had enough of China standing in the way of its expansionist dreams. Japanese forces seized the city of Mukden and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. By the spring of 1934, it became clear that Japan was no longer satisfied with only controlling territory north of the Great Wall and declared all of China a Japanese preserve. Tokyo stated that China could no longer take action or make decisions without the consent of Japan. By 1937, China could no longer accept Japanese aggression on the mainland. A minor conflict along the Marco Polo Bridge close to Beijing started on July 7, 1937, as the result of a, quote, misunderstanding. However, this small battle quickly escalated into the Second Sino-Japanese War, when it became clear that China would not just bow to Japanese demands. The nationalists and the communists in China found a common enemy in the Japanese and put their differences aside for the time being to fight as a united front. This bolstered Chinese military numbers, but like in past conflicts, China would find that large numbers don't win wars. Due to political unrest and the oppressive nature of Japanese policies in the region, Beijing had not invested nearly enough time or resources into modernizing its military, making it ill-equipped to fight a war. When the conflict started, Japanese forces rapidly dispatched Chinese opposition. It only took 2 years for Japan to capture most of China's ports and major railways. By 1937, Chinese forces had been pushed out of Shanghai, and in December, Nanjing, the nationalist capital, fell to Japan. The occupation of the city and the decimation of its population by the Japanese would become known as the Nanjing Massacre. Around 300,000 Chinese civilians were slaughtered by Japanese troops. After the fall of Nanjing, Japanese forces dominated China. They took Canton, Shanxi, and Inner Mongolia. Chinese defense was ineffective in almost every battle. Its military had no control over the sea or air, as Chinese technology was so far behind the modernized Japanese forces. China's losses were staggering, but the nation's size and large population allowed it to endure much longer than the Japanese had anticipated. Every time Japanese forces would close in on a location of the Chinese leadership, they would pack everything up and move further west. This eventually led to a stalemate. China's tactics theoretically kept them from losing the Second Sino-Japanese War, but at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives and millions of people wounded. By the time World War II broke out, nationalist China had run into serious economic and social problems as Japan occupied much of the country. And there was unrest among the Chinese people. Once again, rather than focusing on its citizens, the Chinese leadership poured everything into the war effort even though it had very little chance of succeeding. This led to a massive number of refugees fleeing west, runaway inflation, and a general bad time for the civilians within China's borders. Malnutrition ravaged the population, and the Chinese people lost faith in their government. There was no good option for China when Japan became aggressive, but the mistakes and missteps that the nationalist government made led to large amounts of pain and suffering for the Chinese population. When more and more support for communism arose in China, the government instituted oppressive measures to try to suppress the movement. This was another mistake that had ramifications for both the war and the country as a whole. The Communist Party gained more control as the result of nationalist crackdowns, and its armies grew. Like in the Second Opium War, the Chinese military was about to be faced with a war against its own people and a foreign invader. Clashes between the nationalist forces and communist forces began throughout the region, all while Japanese occupied much of the country. The inability of China to remain unified even during one of its bloodiest wars in history shows how poor leadership may have been one of its biggest weaknesses. The main reason China was eventually able to reclaim the territory occupied by Japan was because of the intervention of the United States. As the war in the Pacific erupted in 1941, the U.S. began sending supplies to China from India. The U.S. trained Chinese soldiers and engineers. However, Chinese forces had been diminished to the point that they played a relatively small role in pushing Japan out of mainland Asia. Modern day. On October 1, 1949, the People's Republic of China was formed. Since then, China has not participated in a major war. We'll circle back to this fact as being one of the military mistakes of the current Chinese leadership. That being said, China was involved in some very minor conflicts. Early in the morning of October 23, 1962, the sun rose over the hilltops of the Himalayas. Indian soldiers heard the far-off sound of artillery fire echoing off the cliff faces. Shells exploded along the line of actual control between Chinese-controlled Tibet and India. A contingent of Chinese soldiers approached the border and began to fire at the Indian border guards. This was a poorly planned attack, but it appeared at the time that China was ready to start a full-blown war with India. The Indian soldiers were overrun, 17 men died, and 13 more were captured by the Chinese invasion force. The remaining Indian soldiers fell back to the nearby Buddhist monastery at Tawang, which the Chinese attacked the following day. Small skirmishes broke out across the region. Indian soldiers tried to mount a resistance, but the mountains made this area incredibly hard to reach. The Chinese soldiers continued to march south toward Assam, one of the region's wealthiest and most important settlements. Just under a month after Chinese forces crossed the line of actual control, they retreated back to their side of the border. On November 21, 1962, the Chinese declared a ceasefire, and the war to control the Himalayas came to a swift end. At the time, it seemed China would be successful in occupying Arunachal Pradesh. They had taken numerous mountain villages and towns, so the Indian military couldn't believe their luck when the Chinese military just gave up, for no apparent reason. 1,383 Indian soldiers were killed in the brief war, and around 1,700 went missing in the treacherous landscape of the Himalayan mountains. Chinese records indicate their forces had killed 4,900 Indian soldiers and citizens and captured another 3,968. However, the actual numbers are likely somewhere between the two nations' reports. To this day, no one except for the Chinese government knows why their troops were recalled. Maybe they had other plans, or perhaps the Chinese military thought they had overextended themselves and couldn't resupply its own troops. Yet, even though the Chinese could have taken the Arunachal Pradesh region of India in 1962, they didn't, which seems odd as there would be continued fighting along the border for decades to come. China also briefly invaded Vietnam in 1979 for 29 days. However, no territory was seized or any major changes made to the borders or geopolitics in the region as a result of the Chinese military action. We've now come to the worst military mistake in recent Chinese history. It's not that Chinese leadership has made exceedingly bad decisions or thrown its soldiers into the meat grinder like in the 19th century. Instead, it has to do with the fact that China has not been in a major conflict since World War II. We're not condoning warmongering or saying that countries should constantly be at war, but there's no denying that militaries such as the United States have a lot more experience in warfare than China does. China rarely takes part in UN peacekeeping missions, and since it has remained relatively isolated in terms of military alliances, its joint operations and training have been limited as well. China's worst military mistake of the modern era is that its troops are likely not prepared to fight a war. A lack of wartime knowledge greatly hinders the effectiveness of the Chinese military. Could their unwillingness to engage in past conflicts or work more closely with nations with experience in fighting wars, such as is done with the NATO alliance, be China's biggest military mistake when it comes to future wars? Only time will tell. It's not out of the realm of possibility that if China does end up going to war over Taiwan or any other border dispute, it may fall back on its old tactic of throwing as many troops at the enemy as possible without strategic planning or consideration for their opponent's capabilities. As history has shown, this tactic has not worked out great, yet China's made this very same mistake repeatedly.
One of the things China and the USA have in common is the fact that they're both about the same size. In terms of land area, the US is 3,532,000 square miles, or 9,148,000 square kilometers, not including overseas territories. China is 3,601,000 square miles, or 9,325,000 square kilometers, and no, that doesn't include Taiwan or Hong Kong. Today, we'll attempt to fit the Chinese population inside of the USA and see what happens, and the results might not be what you think. First, we should learn a bit about the populations of each country. Populations are, of course, always changing, but the website Worldometers tries to give an accurate number of the people living in all nations. As we write this, the website tells us that the population of China is 1,419,803,000. We don't need to tell you that it keeps going up and up. The USA has a much smaller but still large population of 328,972,000. So for every one person living in the USA, there's about 4.6 people living in China. Given that massive population, does that make China the most densely populated country in the world? No, not by a long shot. It's the very smallest countries that have the densest populations. China has a population density of roughly 375 per square mile, or 145 per square kilometer. While in 2014, Hong Kong, which is part of China but still an autonomous territory, had a population density of a whopping 6,690 people per square kilometer. Even the UK is much more densely populated than China, which is only the 59th most densely populated country in the world. The USA is actually one of the most spacious countries out there and comes in at 146th on the list. As we said, China and the USA are very close in geographic landmass. You could almost fit one snugly into the other if you played around with the shapes a little bit. But in terms of how spacious a place feels, it really means how packed the populated areas are. A remote mountain area in China is as crowded as a remote mountain area in the USA. So, which country has the busiest cities in terms of finding space? According to the most recent estimates available, in 2018, New York City was the most populated city in the USA, with 8,399,000 residents living there. Los Angeles is way behind at 3,990,000. For New York, there's a population density of 28,317 people per square mile. That makes it the most cramped city in the USA. LA only has 8,484 people per square mile. Shanghai has a much larger population of 26,316,000. But is it more cramped than New York City? Actually, it isn't. Shanghai has a population density of only around 11,000 people per square mile. So New Yorkers would actually feel like they had more space if they were living in Shanghai, while Shanghai residents might consider New York City to be a bit cramped for their tastes. Most sources consider Manila in the Philippines to be the world's most densely populated city, with 107,561 people for every square mile, while others say it's actually Dhaka, Bangladesh. Shanghai, by the way, is 2,448 square miles in area, or 6,341 square kilometers. New York City is much smaller, at only 468.48 square miles, or 1,213 square kilometers. These are each country's biggest cities in terms of population, but there is a long list of Chinese cities with populations bigger than New York. We tell you this, of course, because if the Chinese population was suddenly moved over to the US, then they would most likely have to populate the cities. If we dropped, say, the population of Beijing, about 22 million and 3,400 people per square mile, next to Mount Katahdin in northern Maine, we'd have a problem as there is no infrastructure. So when we talk about upping the US population, we're focusing on the places people can live. As we said, China's huge population means the country has a much greater number of large population cities. When you look at lists of world's largest cities by land area, whether urban area or metropolitan area, Chinese cities make up a lot of the lists, as do Indian cities. In fact, in the top 50 largest cities, we only see New York City on the list from the USA, whereas China makes the top 50 a staggering 23 times. What this means, of course, is that if the USA had the same population as China, and city dwellers remained city dwellers, then many cities in the USA would be extremely crowded places. China can deal with that many people. The US would struggle. Okay, so what would the consequences be of this population explosion? Well, if it happened at once, say by magic, all hell would break loose. If the population was the same ratio of children to adults, there'd be too many children to feed and too many adults for jobs, not to mention a lot of houses with too few beds. Could this happen? Obviously not, but if it ever could, it would have to mean something happened which resulted in a huge migration to the USA. We might have to invoke alien attack here because we don't feel this could be anything but science fiction. According to the IMF's World Economic Outlook database, the nominal GDP for the USA in 2018 was the highest in the world at $19.39 trillion. China was $12.01 trillion. If we look at this in very simplistic terms, it should mean there's enough cash in the USA to feed a population that was the same as China's. Although massive changes in the allocation of funds, new taxes, and changes to monetary policy would have to happen. Still, there's little doubt this new population could eat. It would just mean some growing pains for a while. Let's say things were straightened relatively quickly thanks to American ingenuity. There would still be too many people filling cities that once had far fewer people. There would have to be a drastic expansion, and that would mean spending an incredible amount of money on infrastructure. But given the USA's incredibly high defense budget, which could be slashed, and so many billionaires ready to be taxed, we think that this could be done without a total catastrophe. Things would be tough at first, and no doubt a lot of the population would be up in arms, but once they knew they had no choice, they'd deal with it. In our sci-fi, hypothetical, crowded America, we're assuming people of the world, for the most part, would be willing to collaborate to build a bigger, better America. One of the very real problems with this influx of new folks would be the degradation of natural spaces and depletion of resources. As Jared Diamond points out in his very real book, Collapse, parts of the USA are already suffering from the overconsumption of natural resources and the negative effect this is causing on the environment. More people means more pollution. It means more polluting industries, more cars, more houses, more degradation of farmland. There would no doubt be some scarcity. Fish-depleted rivers would need to be filled. People might even have to learn how to be more self-sustainable. People would also have to put their trust in the government, and a whole group of roundtable experts would have to get busy coming up with ways to accommodate these new folks without taking the USA to the brink of collapse. Diamond points out that societies have completely disappeared in the past because there just wasn't enough resources to accommodate a growing number of people. But the point he makes is that collapse in hindsight was probably always avoidable had those societies been savvier about overconsumption and the sustainability of natural resources. Some societies chopped down all their forests in part so they could build monuments to show how strong they were. Bad move. In the new US, people would care less about what they had. There would be less conspicuous consumption and more people would embrace a kind of communitarian life. No, that doesn't mean communism, it means working together for the greater good. There would have to be a profound change in habits and some great innovations. Let's just say because of these A-teams of innovators and a public willing to make profound lifestyle changes, the plan came together. Would a more crowded America sink into poverty? We think the answer is no, not at all. More people means more brains, more innovation, and you work with what you got. Sure, parts of America that have been historically underpopulated would have more people, but those people could and would be useful. We call this sci-fi situation the Great Expansion, and it wouldn't be that different from the expansion America saw in the 19th century when wagon trains, many full of immigrants, went west to stake claims in new territory. It could be a catalyst that made people think more about the environment and act in a way that aligns with human progress and happiness. America would deal with the Great Expansion, but modern Americans, like their hardworking forefathers, would learn to find greatness as the country builds a new frontier.
The year is 2013. Xi Jinping, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, has just seen the plans to transform some scattered reefs in the South China Sea into a fortified concrete island, complete with its own hospital, an airstrip, and a military base. Seemingly out of nothing, China will build a base from where strategic bombers can be based and fly thousands of miles from. This could be a stroke of a brush that paints the picture of the end of human civilization. If you think that sounds crazy, you may change your mind when you get to the end of the show. China has been very busy building more artificial islands like this, while much of the world has been looking the other way. China's Great Wall of Sand has been taking shape. This has caused many sleepless nights for folks in Washington. Before we get into the many reasons for the sleepless nights, let's look at this Great Wall of Sand. First named that by a U.S. admiral, the island we just mentioned in the intro is called Fiery Cross Reef. That's what it used to be, just a scattering of reefs. There was nothing there, but then that all changed. In 2013, China decided it was time to transform the place along with other land dotted around the South China Sea. In 2014, between the months of August and November, Chinese dredgers got busy moving a lot of sand around Fiery Cross Reef. Then came the concrete trucks to cover the sand. The end product was an island about 3,000 meters long and 300 meters wide. It wasn't long until Chinese people were in their living rooms watching China Central Television and being told about this state-of-the-art military island from where H-6K strategic bombers could take off. Brimming with pride, they were told there was a hospital there, but more importantly, military installations home to early warning radar systems and various weapon systems. China had created a monster in the South China Sea, and many more monsters would follow. If you went to Fiery Cross Reef today, you'd find garrisons that house something close to 200 troops. Some of them work with surveillance technology, some of them are weapons experts. In 2016, China landed passenger planes there, one from China Southern Airlines and another from Hainan Airlines. This is not an island anyone will be visiting on their vacation. The tests were merely to see what kind of large aircraft could safely land there. There are presently enough hangars to store 24 combat aircraft and 4 much bigger planes. As we told you, the runway is now long enough to accommodate one of China's Shan H-6N bombers. One of these beasts could take off from the island and perform combat operations as far as 3,500 miles away. The planes are capable of being refueled in the air and can fire air-launched cruise missiles. The CIA has been watching the development of these planes for decades because of their nuclear weapon-carrying potential. In 2019, the CIA heard that the newest rendition of the H-6N could carry the mother of all bombs. This is the most powerful non-nuclear bomb in the world. That might be worrying for the US, but it's just as worrying for other countries that are close to the island. This Great Wall of Sand that China has been building includes islands and areas that are disputed. In the Spratly Islands, China, Vietnam, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei all lay claim to some of the land. Just about every single bit of land has 2 or more countries saying it belongs to them. It's a rather contested part of the world, so when China started building artificial islands on top of reefs and sticking military installations there, other countries didn't exactly look the other way. China's been making hay while its economy shines, creating these islands out of virtually nothing and then bringing in anti-aircraft weapons and anti-missile systems plus all kinds of surveillance tech. China is militarizing the sea, which you'll soon understand is not A-OK with the USA. The Philippines wasn't happy when China started to reclaim a place called Mischief Reef. Again, China sent in dredgers to suck up the sand and build a base, and then it concreted the base. What has been a series of reefs was suddenly home to a harbor and a runway. If you look closely, you can see anti-aircraft weapons and missile defense systems. The island also hosts soldiers and barracks and has an 8,900 feet long runway. Then there's China's disagreement with Taiwan over the Itueba Island, which is also part of the Spratly Islands. Satellite photographs show that right now there are armed soldiers there. A runway also has been built, along with radars and missile sites. But guess what? They aren't Chinese soldiers, they're Taiwanese soldiers. Those are Taiwanese weapons. As you know, China thinks Taiwan is part of it, but the Taiwanese would beg to differ. The Taiwanese people will tell you with a proud heart that they definitely ain't part of China. China calls Itueba Taiping. But get this, the Philippines and Vietnam also claim this island to be part of their country. One of the reasons is that the island lies not far from the fisheries and shipping lanes. There's oil and natural gas nearby, so there's an economic consideration too when arguing over these islands. It's not just about projecting military power. But perhaps more importantly, the islands are close to trading routes for the US said to be worth hundreds of billions of dollars to the American people. China has decided to reclaim many of the islands, so it's not surprising that Taiwan, a US ally, has stuck soldiers and weapons on Itueba. The fight over these places has gone on for decades, sometimes involving bloodshed. But it was really only in 2013 that China started transforming them into strategically useful military installations. The New York Times wrote not too long ago, despite claims of ancient historical links, Chinese officials in the first half of the 20th century were barely aware of the shoals and cays that make up the Spratlys until France annexed 6 of them, including Itueba. China is well aware of them now. These days, the islands are of utmost importance, and this has started to set off alarm bells for the Pentagon, not just around Asia. Take, for example, a place called Woody Island, the largest of the Paracel Islands, also in the South China Sea. Like the other islands, this place was not very significant in the past. It was just a bit of wild area that China, Vietnam, and Taiwan all thought was their own. Since 1956, China has claimed that they own the island. Nonetheless, the mega construction didn't start there until fairly recently. The island now has a large airstrip, military barracks, and weapon systems. It even has a bank. About 1,500 Chinese folks live there at any given time. The place has 2 or 3 artificial harbors where very large ships can dock. These ships could carry massive amounts of cargo, meaning that resupplying the island with weapons and supplies is easy. The runway can be used by bombers and every 4th-generation fighter plane China has. As you probably know, China has many highly advanced fighter planes these days. The stockpile keeps getting bigger and China keeps building runways for them. The US has been watching from a distance as the number of weapons increases. The New York Times wrote in 2016, China had put an HQ-9 surface-to-air missile system on the island. Soon after, it reported that Shenyang J-11BH fighter aircraft were seen there. It goes without saying that what China does on such islands is not always open for global and public consumption, which is why the US has for years been surveilling the area as much as has been possible. Woody Island serves as an HQ for China in this area and gives the country considerable strategic power in the region. Vietnam is a country only too aware of this as it's close by. China has started sending passenger planes to the island and folks have been vacationing there or even getting married there. But experts say this is only about China trying to make the place look less like a militaristic joint than it is. Also, by turning it into an economic zone, it becomes harder for anyone to kick China out. Anyone would think China was preparing for war, but let's remember, China is like any other country in the world. Its main goal is to survive. It wants to maintain its power and sovereignty, and to do that, it needs those trade routes. Having power in this area means also having access to oil and gas, which China needs to have for its economy to remain stable. The US, meanwhile, arguably wouldn't be too upset if China's economy failed, even if the two nations do so much trade together. We'll come back to power politics soon. We very much doubt China would launch any attacks from these islands without a very big reason, but it sure wants to remain a force to be reckoned with in the area, as do some other Asian countries who have rightly accused China of breaking international law when it comes to creating those islands. The Philippines actually took China to court for breaking the rules, and it won. This was about fishing and food security in the Philippines, not really military stuff, although the Philippines, it must be said, is allied with the US. It also allied with China, which is why some pundits say it plays both sides. The Philippines asked the Obama administration for help over China's occupation of the Scarborough Shoal, but no help came, even though US officials condemned China's actions. Critics have said the US verbally admonishing China was not enough. Action needed to be taken against China. Not long after, the leaders of the Philippines turned away from the warm embrace of the US and went for drinks and cigars in China's backyard. Agreements were made between the two nations, China came out smiling, and the Philippines was told Chinese investments were coming its way. China has yet to build military infrastructure on the Scarborough Shoal, though. As the shoal is located only about 217 miles from the capital, Manila, China knows better than to put weapons there. But it's just good to have access to the area. Shipping lanes are like roads paved with gold. But more importantly, if China were to have a conflict with, say, the superpower of the world, having control of these shipping lanes would be absolutely crucial. Most Asian countries don't want to upset the economic behemoth of China, or at least a good number of Asian countries don't. That's because they're also survival machines. They're doing what they think is best for them. It should also be said that when it comes to disputes, China has a lot of sway within what's called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. China often throws its weight around, but that's hardly surprising. The US also wants to protect its shipping lanes in the region, so this is a turf war that in the very worst-case scenario could trigger a real war. Every country involved is just looking after its own interests, but China is being blamed, rightly blamed, for wanting a bit too much. Still, it is threatened in this area. After all, the US has lots of allies in the vicinity. Let's just add here that it's thought that the trade that goes through the South China Sea is worth about $4.4 trillion. That's about a third of all global maritime trade. If US ships could control these shipping lanes with its giant navy, it could almost certainly bring China's economy to its knees if it chose to. It would cause massive suffering in China, but it would also cause global economic turmoil, so it's not as if the US would ever take such an action without there being some pretty hardcore circumstances. And we'll talk more about that soon.
There is no doubt that China is one of the most powerful countries in the world today. To some, China's rise to power has been nerve-wracking. Yet China has always been powerful and influential. And in the grand scheme of human history, China being an economic and cultural powerhouse has actually been the norm. So let's take a look at the evolution of China and why it may be on track to be the world's next #1 superpower. If you want to understand why things are the way they are today, you have to understand the past. The Chinese culture is one of the oldest in the world. And like today, the ancient Chinese were builders. Construction projects on a massive scale are being built right now, putting millions of Chinese citizens to work. And over 2,000 years ago, China was doing the same thing, although there was definitely more slave labor being used in the past. One of the most famous construction projects of ancient times started at the beginning of Chinese history. Qin Shi Huangdi had unified much of the Chinese heartland between 221 and 206 BC, and it was during that time that construction began on the first Great Wall of China. The period following Qin Shi Huangdi's rule was considered the first golden age of the region. Between 206 BC and 220 AD, China saw huge leaps in economic growth and its cultural spread. Approximately 400 years later, a relatively short time in the scheme of things, the second golden age of China began, and it extended its sphere of influence all the way into Central Asia. Just like with all empires, change in power was something to be expected. By the 13th century, the Mongols had conquered China and united much of the country under their rule. During this time, Beijing became the capital, and Westerners such as Marco Polo visited the country. This marked the starting point of contact between China and the West, which eventually evolved into prosperous trading relationships and the exchange of ideas, but also led to death and destruction when the Mongols swept across the Asian continent and invaded Europe. In 1368, the Ming Dynasty overthrew the Mongols and took control of the country, and China moved away from warfare and conquest to start focusing on the country itself. China's economy ramped up due to high agricultural output. The bureaucracy and military were centralized, and the Great Wall of China was completed. We often forget that when learning about other countries, we're taught about them through the lens of our own culture. For people living in the Western world, the history curriculum in school rarely touches on the achievements or cultures of Asian countries. Make no mistake, just because China's early power and influence aren't often taught or talked about, that doesn't mean they didn't happen. China's past was full of advancements and economic growth, something that continues to this day. We know of Chinese influences in the ancient past from written records and archaeological data. As we move closer to the present, we have even more information about the chain of events which led to China becoming one of the most powerful nations on the planet. By the 19th century, Western powers had colonized many parts of the world, including Asia. China had been in a long decline, and the unequal treaties negotiated by European powers had crippled the Chinese economy even further. This led to the destabilization of the government, allowing regional warlords to rise to power. During the 19th and early 20th century, events were set in motion that would lead to modern-day China. It was a time of bloodshed and oppression in the country. Foreign intervention in the affairs of China led to the exploitation of its government and peoples, which led to massive amounts of poverty. Along with Russia and Japan, Western countries exploited China and forced the government into giving concessions while simultaneously weakening the country's ruling body. Then in 1931, Japan invaded China. Over the next decade, they occupied more and more Chinese land. In 1937, the different factions within China united to fight back against the Japanese annexation of their country. Finally, the Chinese took back their lands but immediately fell into civil war, and whoever won would rule the country. China had gone through decades of struggle to regain its land and power. In 1949, Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Party of China, was victorious over the opposing nationalist side during the Civil War. The foundation of modern-day China had finally begun. It's essential not to forget everything that led up to this point. The idea of China's power and influence in the past are still ingrained in the country's cultural history. The memories of oppression and exploitation by the Western nations and their allies were also still fresh in the collective consciousness of the Chinese people. And the longing to return to a time where China's power and economic strength were respected was a driving force for the decisions made by the new communist government. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, a 5-year economic plan that was meant to lift the Chinese people out of poverty and jumpstart the country's economy. It was supposed to collectivize farming and introduce labor-intensive industries. As with all economic plans, not everyone would benefit, and the plan ended up being a complete failure. However, the move toward revitalizing the Chinese economy persisted. Mao's follow-up plan was the Cultural Revolution, which lasted 10 years and changed the country's political and ideological systems. It was a way to inspire a revolutionary spirit in the people, which it did, but not in the way Mao had intended. The masses protested, causing disruptions in the economic, social, and political systems of China. This primed the country for extreme changes. When Mao died in 1976, he was succeeded by Deng Xiaoping. His main goal was to start China on a path to economic reform that would make the country wealthy and influential in the growing world economy. Xiaoping knew that to ramp up the economy, the country needed a healthy workforce. Population growth in China had exploded, which meant there were plenty of workers, but the resources required to support so many people were lacking. In response to this, the government imposed a one-child policy to try and curb population growth. The government also granted peasants the right to farm their own plots of land instead of relying solely on the communist distribution system. These changes resulted in improved living standards and decreased the number of food shortages. Xiaoping also started China's open door policy, which now allowed diplomatic relations to resume and foreign investments to begin within the country. It also provided other nations access to China's very large yet very cheap labor workforce. All of these things combined led to enormous amounts of money being poured into China, setting the country up to become one of the largest economies in the world. China was gaining massive amounts of wealth and influence through relations with different governments and corporations around the world. The open door policy also allowed the development of a market economy and private business sectors. But just like when wealth and growth come to any country, the average citizen does not always benefit. Corruption in the government ran rampant, and influential leaders were getting wealthy from the economic boom. But poverty and cultural shifts led to protests around China. This culminated in the Tiananmen Square massacre. International outrage led to sanctions on China, but this did not stop the economic engine that had already been set in motion. In 1989, stock markets opened in Shanghai and Shenzhen, leading to even more economic growth. 3 years later, Russia and China signed a declaration restoring cooperation between the two countries, which allowed for further economic opportunities for China. In that same year, the International Monetary Fund ranked China as the third largest economy in the world after the United States and Japan. It wouldn't be long until they moved up even further in the rankings. On October 1st, 1999, the country celebrated its 50th anniversary as the People's Republic of China. The following year, the government cracked down on corruption with public executions. Not everyone agreed with the methods of the People's Republic, but the power that they wielded allowed for swift change and few actual repercussions. In 2001, China met with Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan to create the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The mission of this new alliance was to combat ethnic and religious militancy in the countries. Of even more significant benefit to China, though, was the agreement which promoted trade and investment between the countries. With economic opportunity looming around every corner, China took the next step in expanding its power and influence by joining the World Trade Organization. This allowed for negotiations with other countries to lower trade barriers and tariffs on Chinese goods. With fewer restrictions and the ability to trade worldwide more efficiently, the Chinese economy grew faster than ever. Many people still lived in poverty, though, and the government continuously turned a blind eye to unlawful working conditions. Some workers were even treated as slaves or paid an unlivable wage. This allowed Chinese companies to make and sell products at lower and lower prices while still making enormous profits. As the economy grew, more resources could be spent on other government projects like military and space programs. In 2003, China launched its first crewed spacecraft. 2 years after that, China and Russia conducted their first joint military exercises. With a powerful ally in Russia and several free trade agreements with other countries in the region, China gained more and more power. While expanding its global influence, China had also been constructing cities and internal renovation projects that created jobs and cash flow for its citizens. In 2006, China finished building the world's largest hydroelectric dam, called the Three Gorges Dam. Later that year, China met with African leaders for the China-African Summit in Beijing. Around $2 billion in business deals were agreed upon in exchange for loans and credit from China. This only furthered China's economic power and gave them leverage in the future. With the industrialization of China, its numerous large-scale construction projects, and the desire to keep its economy growing, concerns about public and environmental health had fallen to the wayside. The government acknowledged that pollution in the country had reached critical levels and that new policies would be implemented to deal with the problem. However, this did not stop the economic drive of the country. The government continued to pour money into technology and the military. China tested long-range missiles and even shot down an old weather satellite in space, showing the world that they now had missiles capable of hitting targets in orbit. In 2008, as the global economy slowed down, the Chinese government announced a $586 billion stimulus package to ensure their economic growth wouldn't stall. To secure the resources they need, China signed a $25 billion deal with Russia, making sure that the country has enough oil for the next 20 years. In 2010, China became the world's largest exporter, and the following year, China overtook Japan as the world's second largest economy. And even after China overtook Japan, it continued to grow its economy until 2014, at which point things finally started to slow down. China's economy is still growing, but not at the incredible rate that it had been over the previous decade. Thanks to a strong economy and a government with absolute authority, China grew into one of the most powerful nations in the world. But this is not surprising, as even in the past, China was incredibly influential. They had the workforce to ramp up their economy, and once they switched from isolationist policies to joining the global economy, there was very little that could stop China's progress. The economic gains made by China did pull hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but at the expense of polluted air and unsafe working conditions. Whether your political ideology is for or against the way China runs its country, there's no denying that there were benefits from the reforms and economic policies they implemented. Education rates have gone up drastically, and it's estimated that by 2030 the same percentage of Chinese workers will have a university degree as countries in Europe have today. However, many poor rural communities in the country have low skill levels and an aging workforce, but this is also true in other economically advanced countries around the world. China became powerful by taking a different path than Western countries, and now with a thriving economy comes the ability to have a strong military and loan out money to other countries, which can be used as leverage in the future. It's no surprise that after a time of relatively low economic and cultural output during the European colonization, China would eventually return to its norm as being one of the most powerful countries in the world, a position it's held for much of its multi-thousand-year history.
A man is standing in the train station after just being told he's not allowed to board a high-speed train. Standing opposite him is a woman with a gadget in her hand and something on the screen blinking red. She points to an image and he thinks, "You have got to be kidding me," as he stares at a cute Shih Tzu dog over which there's a large red X. The guy almost falls over when he sees a picture of himself wearing pajamas in public. Again, it's marked with an X. Can you guess what he's done wrong? We doubt you can, because it's not the kind of thing that would naturally spring to mind, certainly not in the Western world. We'll explain this man's transgression soon, but for now let's just say he's been a bad boy, and his citizen score is less than admirable. In China, Big Brother is always watching. If you want to rank your citizens, you have to keep an eye on them constantly. So first of all, let's see how China does that and compare it with the West. The study we found revealed that for China's 1.4 billion plus population, there were around 200 million CCTV cameras. That works out to just over 14 CCTV cameras for every 100 people. We should add that there are lots of similar studies about China's surveillance, and they all report unique data. Another study says China has 540 million CCTV cameras, and that's quite a difference. From what we can see, the 200 million number is probably too low. If the 540 million figure is correct, that would be about 38 cameras for every 100 people. All the studies we found agree that China has the most surveilled cities on the planet, with the UK and the US also appearing in the top 10 lists of CCTV surveillance. Some studies suggest the US has anywhere from 47 to 70 million CCTV cameras, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics said the number's closer to 85 million for the 336 plus million people in the US. That would work out to be about 25 cameras for every 100 people. The UK is also very high, with about 7 million CCTV cameras for its 67 plus million people. That's close to 10 cameras for every 100 people. Although other sources say this number is way too low, while researchers can't seem to agree, many say in China, the US, and the UK, there is one camera for every 3 or 4 people. But in a world where it seems like there's a camera for every few people, isn't it fair to ask, who's watching the watchers? Well, we got a solution, and it comes from the sponsor of today's video, Private Internet Access, the world's most transparent VPN provider. Boasting over 30 million downloads, PIA truly stands for user privacy. It hides your IP address and keeps your digital life cloaked, shielding it from prying eyes, whether that's your ISP, network admins, or even the government. Using the internet without PIA is like showering in a room with no door. Everyone can hear your bad singing skills. PIA has also proven its no logs policy in court battles, and with an external audit from none other than Deloitte, one of the biggest and most trusted accounting firms in the world. But PIA isn't just about protection, it's also about giving you freedom. Whether you're in Shanghai, London, or New York, it makes all major streaming services accessible, with its servers located in 84 countries and in every US state. Also, PIA VPN is one of the few VPNs that supports P2P file sharing, giving you even more access to content. PIA runs seamlessly across platforms: Windows, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and many others. With a single subscription, you can protect an unlimited number of devices simultaneously. But hold on, it gets even better. We have a special offer for our viewers. Just go to piavpn.com/geopolitico and get an 83% discount on private internet access. And if that didn't convince you yet, subscribing to private internet access is completely risk-free. They have a 30-day money-back guarantee, and if you ever need help, their 24/7 customer support is ready and waiting. So go try private internet access right now. After all, your privacy deserves no less. But as we were saying, while researchers can't seem to agree, many say in China, the US, and the UK, there is one camera for every 3 or 4 people. The saying that comes to mind is, it's what you do with it that counts. In the US, CCTV cameras are often used for policing and security, but not for invasive surveillance. In China, that's the standard. Chinese cameras are often hooked up to a high-tech surveillance system. What is also important is online surveillance, something we can get a good idea about from how many official data requests there are from law enforcement to tech companies. We know the numbers in the West, but unfortunately, China doesn't share such data. When it comes to data reports from Google last year, the US was easily the highest in the world outside of China, at over 72,000 in the first half of 2022. India, 32,000 plus, was next, followed by Germany at over 25,000, Brazil over 11,000, and the UK over 9,000. Given the small populations of Germany and the UK, these numbers are relatively high. Still, it's probably nothing compared to how many data requests the Chinese government makes from China's answer to Google, Baidu. Big tech firms in China have no choice but to share data with the government. Some of those big companies are Alibaba, Baidu, ByteDance, and Tencent. Under the Chinese cybersecurity law introduced in 2016, the Chinese government made it legal to conduct checks on any tech company's data anytime it wanted, all in the name of national security. To give you an example of how strict the government is, China's Cyber Administration ordered ByteDance to close a popular social media platform not long ago because it said some of the jokes and conversations amounted to improper public opinion. Not hate speech, just speech the government didn't like. Can you imagine Twitter being shut down for allowing improper public opinion? Actually, there's a story here, but we'll return to this controversial matter at the end. Article 28 of the Chinese cybersecurity law states, network operators shall provide technical support and assistance to public security organs and national security organs that are safeguarding national security and investigating criminal activities in accordance with the law. It basically means when we come a-knockin', you have to open the door. When someone says something the government finds distasteful, the companies, by law, have to give up that person if there is a request. Big Brother is watching you in China more than other countries, which is why China has been described as a giant panopticon. The panopticon was a prison concept created by Jeremy Bentham, the British philosopher behind utilitarianism. If Bentham could see the world in action today, he'd look at China and probably think, yep, that's the way to do it. His theory was that if people understand they're being watched all the time, they'll be motivated to do the right thing. Chinese people know that they're being watched. It's taken for granted, so the theory goes that because they assume they're being watched, they will police themselves. In countries such as the US and UK, people kind of assume they have some privacy, not so much in China. China's Great Firewall blocks various internet sites and ensures lots and lots of information isn't even searchable. There is constant government monitoring of what people look at and post online. There are all those CCTV cameras too, but there's also facial recognition technology. China is leading the way in this field. The US has developed some very advanced facial recognition tech too. Still, we'll show you later, Americans have been fighting back in regard to their faces being scanned. The Chinese government tells the Chinese people that facial recognition is beneficial to them. Some people agree, but this is controversial at the moment. A recent survey by a Beijing research institute revealed 74% of respondents said they'd rather have traditional ways of identifying people than tech scanning them everywhere they went. Even though 57% of people in the study said they were concerned about such tech, 60 to 70% agreed that it leads to less crime. That's because when a criminal is caught using facial recognition, the public often hears about the good news on TV. When a heroin dealer was arrested in the city of Zhangzhou not long ago, the news said the cops spotted the dealer with their new facial recognition glasses. They scanned the guy in the street, the facial recognition got to work, and the dealer was subsequently arrested. The deputy chief of police told the media, "In the past it was all about instinct. If you missed something, you missed it." Chinese citizens might have heard that on TV and thought facial recognition is indeed for the public good, although some of them might not have thought about the implications you're going to hear about later. In another case, over 20 people were arrested at a beer festival in Qingdao. CCTV powered with AI was the reason they were caught. Their faces were in a database, and when the cameras picked them up, the cops were alerted. In Wuhu, cops arrested a guy who was on a murder charge after CCTV saw him buying some dinner from a small food stand. In a study on facial recognition, China was said to be the leader of the world when it comes to countries currently employing it. Russia was second, the United Arab Emirates was third, next in order were Japan, India, China, Brazil, Australia, France, Hungary, Malaysia, the UK, Argentina, the US, and then Mexico. China was easily at the top. It's partly because facial recognition is being used to shame people, not just arrest them. In Suzhou, if people left their home in their pajamas, facial recognition picked them up, and then they appeared on the city's WeChat account. This wasn't against the law, but it was supposed to make them think twice about leaving the house not properly dressed. The program was supposed to expose uncivilized behaviors and improve citizens' quality. But the city later admitted that it went too far and apologized. They wrote, "We wanted to put an end to uncivilized behavior, but of course we should protect residents' privacy." A park in one city used the technology to stop people from stealing toilet paper. Some schools have also tried that out. It was employed to spot kids who weren't paying attention in class. So yes, facial recognition tech is now everywhere in China. But today we're talking about social credit, a person's citizen score. Facial recognition is helping with this. As we just told you, sometimes the people in the wrong appear online or have their picture printed somewhere. There are many reports of walls of shame harkening back to the days of Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution. In 2018, it was reported that in Anhui there were giant billboards featuring the names and faces of people who hadn't paid their debts. According to South China Morning Post, there were 10.5 million people who were publicly listed in China for being in debt. To address the problem of debt, the People's Court of Hejiang County in southwest China's Sichuan province showed moviegoers trailers in the theater featuring debtors. Can you imagine that? Sitting down with some popcorn to watch Fast and the Furious 25, and you star in the trailers. This is what social credit scores are sometimes about, shaming people so they'll do the right thing. It really is the digital panopticon. It works too, or at least it has worked in some of the stories we read while doing research for the show. At a busy intersection in the city of Shenyang, jaywalkers and fast drivers used to cause chaos, so the city used CCTV cameras with facial recognition cameras and installed a giant screen. Soon, lawbreakers' faces appeared on the screen with their names and other details. This was not just about fining people, it was about shaming them. Jaywalking rates soon decreased, but was all that spying a good thing? Some people thought so, especially when they heard bicycle thefts also decreased in some cities. Ask a Brit about bicycle theft. In the UK, they'll say, if it's not nailed down, someone will take it. But would they want China's kind of surveillance? We'll come back to that at the end. This all still sounds very dystopian, like something from an episode of Black Mirror. It sounds like a life where you might constantly be trying to do good things to accrue more points for more freedom and benefits. It also sounds like George Orwell's book 1984, which is where we get the Big Brother concept from. That's how the Western press has generally painted China's social credit system. But the Western press has sometimes been known for spreading anti-Chinese propaganda. The Diplomat in 2023 said, "Anti-China rhetoric is off the charts in the Western media, calling it hysteria and bias." It is true, on any given day you can find a certain hysteria regarding China and how awful it is. Sometimes the criticism is definitely warranted, but the many social credit system articles in the media were and are in fact wildly exaggerated. To give you an example, in 2018, Vice President Mike Pence said, by 2020, China's rulers aim to implement an Orwellian system premised on controlling virtually every facet of human life, the so-called social credit score. In the words of that program's official blueprint, it will allow the trustworthy to roam everywhere under heaven while making it hard for the discredited to take a single step. While China's surveillance is shocking, nothing like the dystopian reality many viewers have discussed is true. No one in China has ever been barred from the cinema at 20 for kicking a dog in high school. There's never been a national database full of people's scores. People are not watched all day, all night, so they'll always do the right thing. You won't get penalized because you decided to read books by George Orwell. The social credit system was never about controlling every facet of human life. The system was set up in various Chinese cities, that much is true, but it was mostly about getting people to pay their debts or about folks being a public nuisance and doing things like stealing bicycles. What the Western press usually left out was that the cities testing it often asked people to volunteer for the scheme. In fact, in many places, the system was there to expose public officials who'd been corrupt. In other cases, you could receive a bad score for not paying your debts, And while you might appear on a national database, this wasn't much different from the credit scores you get in most Western nations. Rather than this being something the Chinese people were worried about all the time, most folks never gave it a second thought if indeed they knew such a system existed in their city. It was an experiment in most places, often only involving businesses. For instance, if a business kept ripping people off or selling dodgy equipment, it might appear on a list. Some people, of course, appreciated this. That's not what we heard, though. A spokesperson for the U.S. National Broadband Task Force for the FCC under Obama said that this would be the end of freedom in China, explaining China would not only become a totalitarian police state that monitors its people, but one that completely evades users' privacy. He added all forms of activity and interactions, online or otherwise, will be rated, available to view, and stored as data. Such words sparked outrage and fear. There were subsequent discussions in the US with people saying just because you play many hours of video games doesn't mean you're idle, and just because you don't have kids doesn't mean you're irresponsible. Some people said there's nothing wrong with having a beer after a hard day's graft. Not all keep fit fanatics are good people, said others. For God's sake, Ted Bundy worked on a hotline for vulnerable women after working out in the gym. But none of these conversations were relevant to anything. China wasn't trying to score people's lives to put them in the good or bad camp. As the fear in the West was spreading like the Black Death, Chinese people might have read Western media and thought, what in Confucius's name are they talking about over there? Sure, Chinese people, or most Chinese people, know they live with a lot of surveillance. Some of them have protested against it in the street, just as surveillance technology was trying to track their masked faces. When some people protested against China's pandemic policies, facial recognition recognized them, and soon the cops were at their door. Nonetheless, Chinese people would probably still look at you with a funny expression on their face if you asked them what their entire life social credit score was, or if you told them to go easy on the beer lest they get denied entrance to the panda enclosure at the local zoo. The main point of the system in most places where it was trialed was to cut down on corruption and business fraud rather than prevent children from seeing pandas at the zoo because their father played League of Legends for 8 hours straight. People know they're surveilled, make no mistake, but the 1984 reality that was portrayed in some parts of the Western media was unknown to many Chinese citizens. A senior research fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center in Beijing explained to Wired, the system as it exists today is more of a patchwork of regional pilots and experimental projects with few indications about what could be implemented at a national scale. I really think you would find a much larger percentage of Americans are aware of Chinese social credit than you would find Chinese people are aware of Chinese social credit. In many places, the schemes were more like loyalty reward programs. In other cities, if people had a good credit rating relating to their finances, they might later be trusted to defer paying some medical expenses. They were never about tracking or recording someone's entire life. As of 2022, it's thought there were 62 such systems in towns and cities throughout China. In many cases, people chose to take part because they wanted the rewards. People would gain points and get a free health checkup or a discount on a bike hire, or they could get fast-tracked for a visa application. In the experiment so far, in some cities at least, only between 1.5% and 15% of residents agreed to take part. They were also told their score only worked in that city, since other cities often use different systems. There have been blacklists and red lists for businesses, with the businesses on the red lists being the ones that haven't breached any industry regulations. These regulations were already there in Chinese law, but now there was a website where people could find businesses that had violated the regulations and ones that hadn't. So the point system was there to help people find a business they could trust. In other cases, you could end up on the list if you didn't pay a fine. This does indeed sound a bit dystopian, but it's still not quite Black Mirror-esque. If people were on a court's blacklist, they might not have been able to buy a high-speed train ticket. There are reports of parents not paying their debts, ending up on a blacklist, and their children being denied entrance to a school or a university. There was the case in which a guy's children were not allowed to enter a certain school because of his debts. Then he paid them and the kids were good to go. In another case that will resonate with Americans, especially New Yorkers, Beijing introduced a point system for its rapid transit system. You could lose points for being a nuisance on the train, such as eating, blasting music, drunkenness, smoking electronic cigarettes, acting threatening, or anything along those lines. Breaking the law was breaking the law, but smaller acts of misbehavior meant bad social credit. In the city of Guangzhou, the local government said you could appear on a blacklist system if you didn't pay your bills, insurance, taxes, or utility fees. The scheme also made it so that if young people cheated on their exams, they could end up in the database. A local government announcement explained, "The public credit information of natural persons cannot be seen by everyone and can be queried at will. but can be disclosed through inquiries and the sharing of government affairs and is generally not publicized. In a case we mentioned at the start, one city thought about a law concerning pets. That's because the city had problems with people abandoning their dogs and cats when they became bored with them. So, in the proposal, a man said, let's dock them points for doing that. It didn't mean they'd go to jail, but they might find out something became unavailable to them. Reports state that the Chinese government has prevented over 20 million people from buying plane tickets because they're on a blacklist for the things we've described. To most Westerners, this might sound nightmarish, and for a good reason, but the social credit system still wasn't as bad as reported. That doesn't mean it's not oppressive, though. The surveillance in China to most Americans does seem horrific, given that Americans value their privacy and independence arguably more than other countries' citizens. The US came second after Israel in a World Population Review study of the most individualistic countries. In another study, the US came in first, followed by Australia and the UK. China ranked near the bottom. Americans might not like it if the US government awarded people points for eating healthy so as to cut down on obesity, one of the US's most costly and deadly issues. For most Americans, that's way too much government in their lives. The UK government has actually mulled over a privacy-busting app to fight the obesity crisis. This was indeed a kind of social credit scheme. People would be awarded points for eating the right foods. Remember, people these days pay for things using their phones, so it's easy to track what they eat. In 2021, the gov.uk website wrote, "Pilot scheme will motivate people to make healthy changes to their lifestyle." It added the government is committed to helping people lead healthier, happier lives by making it easier for people to make healthy choices. You can't argue that people need to eat better to live better lives, on average anyway. Still, the age-old question arises, how much government do people need in their lives? Some people argue that Britain, remember, a country where you're almost always on CCTV, could be the next country to initiate some kind of social credit system. In 2021, the Spectator newspaper wrote, "We need to act now to block Britain's social credit system." This was mostly about the pandemic and vaccine passports, but the article added, "The government is planning to introduce a health app in January which will monitor our shopping, our exercise levels, our intake of fruit and vegetables, and reward us with virtue points which we can exchange for discounts, free tickets, and other goodies." Virtue points, said the article, sounds a lot like China. China is leading the way in surveillance, but are other countries trying to catch up? The UK just introduced a highly controversial police act that'll make it harder to protest. There are recent reports of people being arrested for what Orwell would have called a thought crime. Police arrested people for embracing their freedom of expression online. While these instances might have offended someone, they only involved citizens airing opinions. The cops called these non-crime hate incidents. Critics pointed out that this was quite an Orwellian expression. People were contacted and put on the blacklist because of the possibility of committing a crime in the future. Over in the US, the Twitter files showed the government agencies were able to tell Twitter executives to shadow ban or block stories they thought were dangerous misinformation. Turned out to be true, and in fact, never even looked like misinformation to a discerning eye. This was very much in-your-face censorship, said many people. It was the government shaping narratives, they said. It turned out people were being watched for what they said and put on blacklists even if they had a very valid opinion. This is absolutely normal in China, but not in America. Some people or groups in the West worry about being blocked from using financial transaction systems. A free speech advocate writing in The Hill said, "This could create a system in which individuals who do not hold certain political views could be blocked from polite society and left unable to make a living." If people fear not being able to get money, will they stay in line and say the right thing? This is why some people worry about such things as the digital dollar, similar to China's digital yuan. Many Westerners fear all currency going digital in case they're frozen out of their money. 60% of transactions in China are already cashless, but other countries, including the US, are also much more cashless these days. What if PayPal locked you out, or a government threatened GoFundMe for no rational reason, and that prevented you from getting much-needed funds? This is one of the reasons the American Civil Liberties Union said in 2019, "Say no to the cashless future and to cashless stores." A writer for CNBC called it a huge threat to our freedom because it'll permit governments to exercise incredibly powerful control over all human behavior. Statistics show that the Asia-Pacific region leads for the number of cashless transactions, followed by Europe and then North America. In terms of what people want, 77% of South Koreans said in a survey they prefer cashless. Sweden was next at 74%, then came Russia, 72%, UK 70%, France at 67%, China at 67%, Spain at 61%, Japan at 60%, and the US at 58%. This was a big study featuring 676,000 people. In a Privacy HQ poll, 47% of Americans were actually for some kind of social credit system, 14% were neutral, 39% were against it. Gen Z was the most up for it. The older people were the least in favor, with the middle-aged in the middle. Uber and Airbnb already have such a system. Social media sites also sometimes have a strike system. So in some ways, we already have a social credit system. Still, in that poll, lots of people said they feared the loss of freedom to speak, too much government control and bias in the system. People worry about living in a world where they're watched and recorded at all times, where their faces are analyzed by AI, perhaps while protesting about controversial government measures. You need top-class facial recognition to do this. Studies show in 2008, China wasn't really selling its surveillance tech anywhere in the world. Now, over 80 nations have imported Chinese surveillance technology. Some cities in the US, including San Francisco, have banned the use of facial recognition by police. In the state of Illinois, the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act prevents cops from scanning faces. Many people feel this way in the US. Some companies, such as Microsoft and Amazon, scaled back development after a public outcry. Many Americans are not too keen on going down the Chinese route of mass surveillance. Facial recognition and social credit scores might be coming, never mind what happens. If it can be shown it worked well at some point or another, especially where violent crime is concerned. Maybe some people will still say it's going too far and embrace what Confucius once said, cultivate the root, the leaves and branches will take care of themselves. Do we really need a panopticon? China's social credit system may not have been as bad as we were told, but it did point to a new reality in which people are watched all the time that they're out in public.
The United States, the world's premier military power. China, a rising power that may one day be able to challenge the US's own, but today cannot. What if these two military giants went head-to-head though, and the conflict played out on China's own shores? What if the United States decided it needed to invade China? Could China defend from a US invasion? First though, is conflict between the two even probable? The short answer is yes, and the possibility is frighteningly real and seemingly only growing more realistic by the day. Today, these two great powers find themselves locked in what historians have come to term Thucydides' trap. Thucydides was an ancient Greek historian who commented on the rise of Athens and the fall of Sparta. For a long time, Sparta was the reigning power of the Greek world, until the city-state of Athens began to rival it in terms of economy, wealth, and military power. The end result was an inevitable war between the two city-states and their allies, as one side, Sparta, sought to hold on to its spot as the #1 power, and Athens sought to dislodge it. If you think that's ancient history, then consider that out of 16 instances in just the last 500 years alone of a rising power supplanting a pre-existing power, war broke out 12 out of 16 times. Clearly, the odds are not good that the US and China can avoid war. To make matters worse, the seeds of conflict between the two nations already exist in a variety of potential flashpoints. The biggest of these are Taiwan's continued independence and China's aggressive and illegal expansion into the South Pacific. Eventually, most likely due to the matter of Taiwan, a conflict between the US and China is likely, especially if China wants to prove it really is a great power. As long as the US Navy reigns supreme in the South Pacific, China cannot claim to be a great power and cannot influence its neighbors the way it wishes to. For China, conflict with the US is all but inevitable, not just a matter of national pride, but one of continued political survival for a communist party that finds itself increasingly isolated from the outside world by growing democratic movements along its borders. So what if the worst came to worse? Could the US successfully invade China? The US's greatest asset is the presence of its forces all around the world thanks to defense agreements with partners and allies. This is a mutually beneficial agreement as it provides a boost to the hosting nation's economy and ensures its continued defense in the case of a war. For the US, though, it has the added benefit of allowing it to stage forces all around the world and quickly react to a conflict. American forces, with their wide network of military installations and partnerships with nations all over the globe, allow them a degree of flexibility and mobility that no other nation can even come close to matching. In a war against China, the US would rely on its Pacific bases to prosecute the conflict. Spurred on by China's growing aggressiveness against its neighbors in the South Pacific, President Obama launched a strategy of encirclement, much like that employed so successfully against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Today, this means that US forces are deployed or can deploy from bases in Japan, the Philippines, Guam, South Korea, Singapore, Australia, and even Thailand. Plotted on a map, this clearly shows how American military power is posed to contain China, no matter in which direction it attempts to move its own military. The reverse is also true. The wide dispersion of U.S. power in the South Pacific allows it to use military force against China from multiple avenues of approach, forcing Chinese defenses to spread out amongst a host of potential threat vectors. However, the primary purpose of U.S. encirclement is not to start hostilities, but rather to respond to them or prevent them altogether. China's chief strategic problem is that it relies on overseas routes for most of its trade, with up to 60% of all Chinese trade passing through the South Pacific. Current U.S. force predisposition has the foot in the U.S. military poised straight on the jugular of Chinese trade, and it would not take much pressure to shut that trade off and send China into an economic collapse. In case of war, this is exactly what would happen. U.S. forces would immediately begin a naval and air blockade of all Chinese trade, boxing in the Chinese Navy all the way from the Malacca Straits to the Sea of Japan. While the Chinese Navy now for the first time in history outnumbers the U.S.'s own Navy, it largely lacks a capability to operate far from its own shores and is best suited for coastal defense. This would make it impossible for China to send a naval expeditionary force to the Malacca Straits and secure them for its trade ships. Then there's the added complication of U.S. allies and partners in the area who would indubitably join the U.S. side in the conflict. Chinese ships trying to leave their territorial waters would find themselves threatened on all sides, on top of having to deal with the formidable American Pacific Fleet. At the same time that the U.S. ships are blocking off Chinese trade, though, the People's Liberation Army rocket force would saturate U.S. bases in Guam, South Korea, Japan, and possibly even the Philippines. These attacks would overwhelm American missile defenses and cause considerable damage, requiring weeks of repair to bring them back into operational status. This huge missile volley would greatly delay U.S. offensive operations by both its air and naval fleets, not to mention the preparation of any sort of invasion force. However, it would also greatly anger the nations that host U.S. forces, as missiles like the DF-21 ballistic missile have a margin of error that can be as much as several hundred meters. Missiles would be destroying not just U.S. forces but also Japanese, South Korean, and Filipino military assets and even civilians. This would further cement support for U.S. action against China. The Chinese missile stockpile numbers in the thousands, but it is ultimately finite, and military facilities can always be repaired faster than missile stockpile can be replenished. Not to mention that long before a second volley can be fired, U.S. forces would have moved to heavily damage China's command and control assets. In the opening of the war, American stealth bombers would strike at Chinese long-range surveillance radar, command and control nodes, and precision military systems deep inside the country. These attacks would be mirrored by a missile barrage nearly as large as China's own being launched by America's large submarine fleet, most of which are capable of carrying long-range land attack cruise missiles. While China may be able to hold the U.S. surface navy at bay with its rocket forces for a few weeks, possibly even a few months, the U.S. submarine force would be impossible to target with those same rocket forces. And given China's extreme lack of anti-submarine warfare assets, the American Silent Service would all but have the run of China's coast. American stealth aircraft and submarine forces would continue striking deep into China, destroying air defense networks, satellite communication nodes, and other vital facilities for coordinating China's ability to threaten the American Navy. U.S. stealth bomber losses would no doubt be very high, potentially knocking the entire fleet of 20 U.S. B-2 bombers out of commission within the first few weeks. Air attacks would then have to rely on unmanned drones, supplemented by submarine cruise missile strikes, but eventually Chinese defenses would be eroded enough to allow B-1 and even B-52 strategic bombers to begin to soften up Chinese coastal defenses. Going any further inland would likely be fatal for B-1 and B-52s, even at this stage of the war, with the Chinese Air Force suppressed but very much still capable. Escorting those non-stealthy bombers, however, would be American F-22 Raptors and F-35s, which would operate from repaired facilities in Japan and South Korea. While the U.S. would suffer losses to both its F-22 and F-35 fleets, the loss ratio would be extremely favorable. After a few weeks of air operations, enough of China's air defenses and most of its formidable fighter aircraft would have been thinned out to allow non-stealthy U.S. Air Force F-15s and Navy F-18s to join the fight, considerably boosting the presence of American combat aircraft. American air forces are not just more capable than China's, but considerably larger as well, with 13,264 total aircraft versus China's 3,210. Of those aircraft, the U.S. operates nearly double as many combat aircraft as China, at 2,085 versus 1,232. To make matters worse for China, U.S. aircraft are overwhelmingly more modern and capable, and its pilots more experienced. China may have the home field advantage, but the US would dominate the air and sea war within a few months, putting a stranglehold on China economically. In the real world, this is the limit of the US's plans for a war with China. Destroy its Navy and Air Force and strangle it economically into submission. In today's scenario, though, we're taking this a step further. Preparation for an invasion of China would take many months and require the mustering of most of the US's amphibious forces. If the US wanted to gather an invasion force and maintain its global commitments as they stand today, it would need to institute a national draft, which could potentially see it add up to 145 million additional personnel to its military. However, China's 1.3 billion strong population could muster up a defensive force of 753 million. Though with its much smaller military budget, a floundering economy due to the US's stranglehold on its trade, and damage on its infrastructure caused by American air and naval attacks, China would only realistically be able to train up and equip a small percentage of this number. Likewise, the US would only be able to equip a small percentage of its own reservists, leaving the numbers advantage firmly in Chinese hands. The US has always had the capability to move forces around in large numbers relatively fast, but in recent years it's greatly increased its expeditionary capabilities, adding a number of mobile landing platforms, afloat forward staging bases, and amphibious assault ships. Today, the US maintains 3 Marine Expeditionary Forces, its primary force dedicated to kicking down the door on hostile beaches all over the world. Each force can bring to an enemy's shore between 20,000 and 90,000 Marines and sailors. These would quickly be supplemented by US Army Expeditionary Forces, though they would require longer to assemble, prepare, and transport to a hostile Chinese beach. Initially, the American Marines would be forced to hold the beach alone, though they would not be able to land in their full numbers all at the same time. Not wishing to spread themselves too thin, and with US air and naval power only capable of carving out a very small slice of safety on hostile Chinese beaches, US forces may at best approach the numbers of the amphibious assault in Normandy, averaging between 15,000 and 20,000 personnel per day. This would require a full 3.5 days for an entire Marine Expeditionary Force to make the beach. This would leave 20,000 Marines with the unenviable task of holding a narrow strip of beach against a People's Liberation Army of around 975,000, not counting reservists and conscripts. Even with air superiority achieved, US and Allied aircraft could not hope to hold at bay the vast number of Chinese ground troops, and it's likely that even before the first Marine Expeditionary Force could completely offload onto the beach, the Marines holding them would have been thrown back out into the ocean. Sheer numbers alone make an invasion of the Chinese mainland completely impossible for even the technologically superior US, and it would require the unloading of an entire Marine Expeditionary Force in one single landing to secure a foothold against the vast numbers of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. This is precisely why the United States has no plans of invading China, and instead plans on simply destroying the Chinese Navy and Air Force while blockading it economically in the case of war.
China is a country with infamously harsh laws. There are a lot of things that can get an unsuspecting foreigner into trouble. One wrong move and you could find yourself in prison for a very long time, or more likely, traded in a prisoner exchange eventually. But did you know there are some things that are legal in China but not in the US? Here are 5 areas where China looks at the US and goes, "Lighten up, man." Number 5. Counterfeiting. Kind of. China is a popular location for major corporations who want to take advantage of the cheaper production and labor costs available in the country. So much in fact that it's hard to find a product without "Made in China" on the label, and if you can, the odds are good it might come with a premium price tag. But that's been changing a bit in recent years, with many companies shifting production to other Asian nations like South Korea, India, and Vietnam, and some to Mexico. And there is one big reason for this: intellectual property rights. It's been one of the biggest challenges for manufacturers in recent years. They develop a hot new piece of technology, they troubleshoot it in their American labs, they perfect the design, and then they send it overseas to be mass-produced in Chinese factories. The product hits the market, shortly followed by the Chinese knockoff, which might not have all the features and might break unexpectedly, but it's close enough to take a bite out of the company's profits. China is a massive hub for the manufacture and trade of counterfeit goods, and stopping the flow has been a major challenge. So, is counterfeiting legal in China? Not exactly, but the country's focus on this is very different from what you would find in the US. United States intellectual property laws are designed with the business in mind, with the government serving as an enforcement arm to ensure that the company's holdings are protected. China, however, has a state-run economy. While the country isn't really communist anymore, with a robust private sector, all companies operating in China's border answer to the government. Thus, intellectual property rights, which do not have a long history in China, China are narrowly based on promoting socialist legality with Chinese characteristics. That makes it an uphill battle for any foreign corporation to enforce its intellectual property rights in Chinese territory, and the result has been a counterfeiting boom. In January 2023, a report was released by the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative that identified China as the world's largest purveyor of counterfeit goods. In fact, the U.S. revealed that around 75% of all counterfeit and pirated goods seized by U.S. Customs could be traced back to either China or its reincorporated province of Hong Kong. With few options for enforcement allowed in Chinese courts and Western corporations often facing a hostile environment if they challenge Chinese authorities, companies are usually left to try to stem the tide of counterfeit products by stopping the import of goods via customs. But as the problem gets worse, some Chinese companies are trying some new techniques. Diplomatic pressure from powerful trade partners of China has led Xi Jinping to promise a crackdown on counterfeiting. He's made noises toward improving intellectual property rights, but so far that hasn't amounted to much. And while big companies have had the clout to influence policy, small businesses don't, and often they find themselves on their own. One woman who invented a device to help children taking violin lessons hold their bow properly tried to crack the Chinese market, only to quickly find her niche device had already been cloned and sold as a bootleg in China at a fraction of the price she set. Making it worse, the counterfeiters had stolen her patent and registered it in China. Fortunately, she had a lawyer who could go to court in China and show proof of a fraudulent patent, but it didn't take long before the duplicates emerged again, a process she described as like playing whack-a-mole. And those bootlegs make their ways overseas as well. The best attempt to stem Chinese counterfeiting might not be in China, but might come from multinational tech companies. Sites like Amazon, eBay, and other e-commerce sites frequently bring in Chinese products, and that means the bootlegs often wind up there. The Trump administration scored a win in the battle against duplicate products when it threatened those companies, which forced them to develop better enforcement procedures of counterfeits. But that's just a small part of the larger problem. The only way to stem a tide of counterfeiting at the core is to cooperate with Chinese authorities, hope you have the money and resources to fight a long legal battle and political battle, and bring some good lawyers to secure your trademark, and be prepared to fight that fight as many times as it takes. Doing business in China can be a thorny affair, but so can dining, because you won't believe what's on the menu. Number 4. Eat anything? The year was 2020, and a deadly new virus was spreading across the world. Global lockdowns, millions of dead, and several furious new political movements later, everyone was searching for one thing: someone to blame. As conspiracy theories swirled around, the fact that the virus had seemingly originated in China led to a common theory, that the virus had jumped from animal to human at one of the country's famous wet markets. These traditional markets sell meat, produce, and many other perishable goods that you might find at a farmer's market. They're common in urban areas of China, especially those with a lower average income where supermarkets haven't taken over yet. So what's the big deal? Sounds like standard food shops, except that the offerings at these tend to get a little exotic. Many wet markets sell only standard regulated goods, but many also have a thriving black market where just about any meat is available. This can include local wildlife, imported meat, and even urban animals commonly considered pets. If this sounds unsanitary, it is. Chinese authorities have technically banned the sale of wildlife at these markets since 2003 and the SARS outbreak, but the massive overpopulation in many Chinese cities means a thriving black market exists, and enforcement is difficult, to put it lightly. And this has led to some unexpected guests at the market. The most common suspects for the animal that was infected with the virus that jumped to humans included bats, pangolins, and raccoon dogs, all of which are rather cute animals who suffered a massive PR blow from the virus. Was any of them actually to blame? It's not clear, as China's research into the virus origin is heavily classified, and relations between China and the US are at a low point, so no extensive cooperation has been done on the subject. In the aftermath of COVID-19, China did regulate wet markets further and release a list of animals that could be legally sold, primarily common food animals like cows, pigs, chickens, and fish, but the Chinese laws are still far more liberal than those in the US. Animals like alpaca and deer are commonly on the menu, including a beloved animal in America, the noble horse. China is one of the world's top consumers of horse meat. But does this include man's best friend? It's unfortunately one of the most common stereotypes regarding Asian people, that they eat dogs and cats. But dog meat did commonly show up in wet markets in China for many years, as one of the many animals that wound up on the menu of people looking for some or any meat. Dog did not wind up on the approved list of meats when China revised its regulations in 2020, but there has been no widespread attempt to crack down on the practice. It is likely that the consumption of rare animals in China, including wildlife and those commonly considered pets in the West, is more of a product of widespread poverty than any special sort of tradition in Chinese culture. But there is no question that a visit to a Chinese wet market could be a massive culture shock for any American with less than adventurous tastes. And it's not just that China's standards are loose, it's that the US's standards are unusually high. The U.S. Food Regulation Agency is one of the strictest in the world, especially when it comes to imports. As such, some of the most beloved foods around the world are banned in the United States. These include authentic Scottish haggis, because it contains sheep lung, as well as desserts like cognac-based jellies because of the choking hazard. And even traditional Kinder eggs because the plastic toy contained within could be hazardous if kids swallow it. So, for those looking to broaden their culinary horizons, China might be a better destination than the United States. However, don't be surprised if you get more than you bargained for. It's not the only area where animals might be backing away slowly. Number 3. Trade in endangered species. They're some of the most magnificent creatures in the world and some of the most endangered. The powerful rhino, its sharp horn at the ready to gore any predator that threatens it. The fearsome tiger, one of the world's best hunters with its majestic striped coat. And of course, the largest living land animal, the massive elephant. All of them are stunning to look at, but they're also relentlessly hunted for sport and for valuable parts of their body. As their populations dwindle, with all 3 endangered and several species of rhino going extinct, the world has taken measures to protect them, banning trade of products made from these animals. But that doesn't always work, especially when not everyone's on board. When people think of who's hunting endangered animals, their mind might go to rich Americans coming over to Africa to trophy hunt. But these prominent cases, like the infamous dentist who killed the beloved Cecil the lion, are often the outliers. Not only are they a small portion of hunting incidents, but they're often legal. Organized trophy hunts that cull older animals to provide money to the locals. The vast majority of hunting is done by local poachers and often well organized and heavily armed. These groups are often composed of young men who seek one of the few reliable income streams in the area, because they're the seller, but the buyer is elsewhere. China is one of the world's top locations for exotic wildlife trade. Because some animal parts have roots in traditional medicine in the country, it's long been believed in Chinese culture that both rhino horn and tiger bones have medicinal qualities, and that means those who still subscribe to the old ways will pay a premium to get their hands on the dwindling supply. The poachers hunt the animals wherever they can be found, usually butcher the animal and collect the parts for easy transport, and then send them to China where they can be covertly sold. The sort of professional poaching for profit is considered the largest contributing factor to the possible extinction of these animals. And the world is taking action, but China is proving to be a spanner in the works. The United Nations has a multilateral treaty called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, also known as the Washington Convention, which aims to prevent extinction as a result of international trade. Almost every country is a member of it, with only a few small exceptions like North Korea. China does participate in the treaty, but with some major caveats. Much like with the wet markets and counterfeiting, there's a massive black market in China, and it's made easy for illicit trade in wild animals and endangered species to run rampant without the government cracking down. But it's not all under the table anymore. Wildlife conservationists were shocked in 2018 when China announced that it was legalizing medicinal trade in both rhino horns and tiger bones, overturning a 25-year-old ban. This didn't throw the floodgates open, it imposed stricter regulations, such as only allowing the products to be used in medical research or by accredited doctors in hospitals, or to trade in antique parts. Tiger and rhino parts currently owned can be kept, but not sold privately. But conservationists pointed out one problem with this: there is no proof of any sort of medical benefit to using either of these products. While they're common in folk medicine, most analysts believe them to simply be very expensive placebos. But China might have an ulterior motive for this. While the rhinoceros is mostly hunted in the wild, China does have a tiger breeding program on farms, and these tigers are regularly slaughtered for meat, skin, medicinal product, and even wine made with tiger bones. The new regulations led many people to think that this was a way to stimulate that local industry. Some argue that this is a way to control the poaching that endangers the species, while others say it would be far better to just control the flow of products altogether and choke off the supply. But the news isn't all bad when it comes to endangered species in China. Tigers and rhinos are two of the three prongs of the wildlife trade, with a third being elephant ivory. Unlike tigers and rhinos, China has cracked down harshly on the illegal ivory trade since banning it fully in 2017. This resulted in the arrests of many criminals trying to sell jewelry and other items made from ivory. But while the government has cracked down on the trade, a massive illegal market still exists. And China is one of the easiest places to find products made from endangered animals in an everyday market square. Sometimes it seems you can trade in just about anything in China and with just about anyone. Number 2. Sanctions? What sanctions? In the United States, trade with many countries is an everyday affair. The US is part of a global economy and trades with just about anyone. Despite tensions being high as ever with China, the two remain among each other's top trading partners. However, that doesn't mean the US is trading with everyone. There are several countries that the US doesn't trade with and has strongly suggested that others shouldn't either. These include the Hermit Kingdom, North Korea, for its nuclear program, its hostage-taking, its human rights violations, and its funding of terrorism. It also includes Iran, for many of the same reasons, as well as smaller countries like Venezuela and Syria. Most famously, it includes Russia, primarily for the country's brutal ongoing invasion of Ukraine, which has left it a global pariah. And China is joining forces to sanction none of them. While China and the US are not officially enemies, the two are just short of Cold War at the moment. China sees itself as a regional power and a rising superpower, making it the closest possible rival to the US. As such, it's trying to form a coalition with nations that might be out of the US's orbit, both those that aren't committed to either side and those who are actively opposed to them. That's led China to keep its options open, refusing to sanction most global pariah nations and even becoming the chief supplier for many of them. But each situation is a little bit different and sometimes volatile. In the case of Russia, China plays a key role, but maybe not the way Russia wants. The term BRICS has been all over the media in recent months, referring to a supposed alliance of China, Russia, Brazil, India, and South Africa. Of course, these 5 countries aren't actually aligned, and the entire terminology stems from a Goldman Sachs investment report about rising economies. But as Russia finds itself increasingly isolated, China's become one of the key suppliers of domestic goods and military supplies like body armor, as well as being an important importer of Russian goods, many of which are under embargo. However, it's held off in one key area: it won't sell Russia weapons for the war in Ukraine yet. This is likely because it doesn't want to be targeted by secondary sanctions, as well as because right now, Putin's war looks like a loser and she doesn't want to bet on losers. But in other cases, China's looking for more direct ways to poke at the US. China and the Islamic Republic of Iran have a long history, with relations between the two dating back to 1937. But in recent years, as Iran's nuclear program gained steam and disputes between the country and the United States increase, China's made an effort to pull Iran into its orbit. In March 2021, the two countries signed a 25-year cooperation agreement that includes increased strategic and economic arrangements. However, much like with Russia, China isn't looking to give Iran everything it wants. It's not clear if China actually wants to aid Iran's nuclear program or if they're simply willing to let the chips fall where they may. And of course, there's no country where relations are thornier than with their neighbor to the east. North Korea might be the most isolated country in the world, both by choice and by sanctions. The highly secure nation has been dominated by one family, the Kims, since the Korean War, and still only has an uneasy armistice with its southern neighbor. But while the dictatorship is sanctioned by most of the world, its neighbor is more than willing to help it out. The two countries have a mutual aid and cooperation treaty since 1961, and China is North Korea's main source of luxury goods. The two have regular diplomatic relations, and while trading with these three countries could be serious legal trouble in America, it's everyday business in China. But does China have sanctions against any country? Yes, but that depends on who you ask. China has imposed sanctions on Taiwan as part of its campaign against the island nation. Of course, if you ask Chinese leadership, that's not sanctions against an enemy country. It's an internal political matter involving a rogue province. Sanctions are ultimately more of a political matter than a moral or legal one, and that means if anyone has dealings they want to accomplish with Russia, Iran, or North Korea, China would be a good home base. But of course, none of the countries are particularly safe travel or business destinations. Meanwhile, there's one more thing you can do in China, but not in the US. But only one person has done it, and he's not giving it up anytime soon. Number 1. Be president for life. Politics in China is very different from the United States. While leaders are technically elected, they're picked not by a general vote, but by the Chinese Communist Party leadership. They pick the ruling party's representative, vote for him to take the position, and then he's usually rubber-stamped in elections with little to no opposition. There have only been a few people to hold these leadership positions, with Xi Jinping being the latest. Typically, these politicians serve a 2-term period before being term limited out and replaced by the next functionary. But Xi Jinping isn't like most politicians. He doesn't seem to view himself as a soldier of the CCP, but rather a powerful dictator in his own right. He wanted more power, and he got it. At the annual sitting of the National People's Congress in 2018, the delegates voted to remove the term limits, allowing Xi Jinping to run for a 3rd term, and possibly much more. While he isn't officially president for life, he was granted a 3rd term by the acclamation and has steadfastly refused to elevate any potential successors. Given his tendency toward authoritarian rule, it's highly unlikely any potential successors will stick their neck out and challenge his leadership, and so the next term may be a formality as well. No doubt many politicians want this in the US. That's why they can't have it. For the first 150 years of the United States, there were no term limits. George Washington simply bowed out after 2 terms, and everyone else held themselves to that standard. While Abraham Lincoln might have wanted a longer tenure to see Reconstruction through, an assassin's bullet left that question unanswered. It wasn't until Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the middle of the Great Depression and World War II, that a president decided to go for more than 8 years. He got 4 terms before dying in office. And soon after, Congress and the states passed a constitutional amendment saying 8 is enough. While the idea of repealing the amendment has come up a few times, especially from a certain TV host turned politician, it seems like anyone who wants to be president for life is going to have to head abroad. Is China actually more liberal than the US in these areas? Not exactly. Most of these areas where the laws are stricter in the US are a product of centuries of the culture moving in different directions and different values. And one thing is for sure, no one is getting that president for life title out of Xi Jinping's hands. With the protracted and messy war in Ukraine laying bare many of the inadequacies in Russia's military, it's never been clearer that the 2 definitive global military superpowers are the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. Amidst tensions rising around the Taiwan state, as Chinese saber-rattling crashes up against Taiwanese defiance of Beijing intimidation, it's broadly agreed upon across academics and military experts that there's a non-zero chance of a China-Taiwan conflict in our lifetimes. And if such a thing occurred, it would be incredibly likely that the United States would enter the fray on the side of Taiwan. Naturally, this leads us to the question, who is better prepared for such a conflict? The US has around 1,328,000 active personnel and 799,500 reserve personnel, compared to the Chinese People's Liberation Army numbers of 2,035,000 active personnel as of 2022 and 510,000 in reserves. China clearly wins on that one, but its annual military budget of $293 billion is dwarfed by the US military budget of $816.7 billion. With China's numerical superiority and the United States' far higher military budget, the tiebreaker in this speculative conflict comes down to 2 factors: technology and manufacturing. In plain terms, who has the better equipment, from fighter jets to bullets, and who has the better capacity to build and deploy this equipment. One important area the US is working to strengthen its grip on is the manufacturing of autonomous weapon systems. During an August 2023 Weapons Technology Conference, U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks gave some insight into the Pentagon's intentions in this critical zone. She stressed that China is no idle threat to U.S. national security or a slow, lumbering enemy like those faced in the Cold War. Innovation is an extremely necessary investment in order for the U.S. to keep up with China's military modernization plans. Hicks said, "The PRC worked with focus and determination to build a modern military, carefully crafting it to blunt the operational advantages we've enjoyed for decades." Adding that while China has the numbers and resources to outpace the United States in terms of the manufacturing scale, the U.S. still held dominance and innovation. To put it a little more starkly, she characterized China's advantage as, quote, "mass, more ships, more missiles, more people," whereas the U.S. chief advantage is the ability to imagine, create, and master the future character of warfare. Going on to say, "We'll counter the PLA's mass with mass of our own, but ours will be harder to plan for, harder to hit, harder to beat. We must ensure the PRC leadership wakes up every day, considers the risks of aggression, and concludes today is not the day. And not just today, but every day between now and 2027, now in 2035, now in 2049, and beyond." This really exemplifies the mentality that's given us the U.S. military manufacturing primacy over China for many years. China's focus has been on upscaling, while the U.S. has focused on upgrading, predicting the dynamics of future warfare and staying several steps ahead of the curve. With highly budgeted agencies like DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, constantly researching and developing new projects for the Pentagon. It's working smarter rather than harder. As DARPA's official website says, DARPA explicitly reaches for transformational change instead of incremental advances. This is the doctrine that the entire U.S. Armed Forces follow, preparing to fight the war of tomorrow rather than the war of today. While much has been said about China's sweeping military modernization plans, such claims should always be followed by, but is it enough? Experts are split on this, but in 2021, Mangesh Sawant released an article titled, "Why China Cannot Challenge the U.S. Military Primacy" in the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, which comes out strongly on the dissenting side, arguing that despite efforts made, China's military is still archaic compared to what the United States has to offer. In Sawant's words, less than 30% of China's surface forces, air force, and air defense forces, and 55% of its submarine fleet were modern in 2011. Subsequently, nothing much has changed. China's military faces institutional shortcomings arising from obsolete command structures, low quality of personnel, and corruption. The PLA's loyalty to the CCP has hampered its competence. China's military training and operational capabilities and competencies do not match U.S. standards. China's only option is an asymmetric strategy due to its incapability to fight symmetric wars. Here we see not just the problems plaguing the Chinese armed forces, but also the potential reasons behind them. The U.S. military, unlike China's, can act with a high degree of autonomy, and it's given the aforementioned $800 billion budget to execute development and manufacturing projects to strengthen itself. Given that China is a far more autocratic regime plagued, much like Russia, with government corruption, its military is centralized under the Chinese Communist Party. The best generals, scientists, bureaucrats, and engineers don't rise to the top. The ones who toe the party line don't rock the boat, and kiss up to the party higher-ups do. It's the inherent problem of autocratic governments. China exists in a state of highly controlled propaganda. To admit flaws in the government or the military is to show weakness, and to show weakness is to transgress against the government and incur strict penalties. But the first step to any actual improvement is to make an accurate assessment of the ways a system is falling short, and when these assessments are penalized, it should not surprise anyone that Chinese military doctrine is stagnant. And this same stagnation, of course, extends to the way it manufactures military technology. Let's compare this to the system underpinning U.S. military manufacturing. It would be naive to say that the U.S. military is devoid of corruption. As with anything involving over $800 billion, greed and self-interest are at play. Arms manufacturers lobby for the best contracts, and there is, of course, a political element to who gets installed in the top military positions. But outside of this, the military in the U.S. has good reasons to get results. The various arms contractors, such as Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, which are responsible for a large majority of U.S. military manufacturing, need to do well to keep their contracts, or risk losing them to rivals. This is a dynamic that simply doesn't exist in China, where no company can truly exist separately from the government. There's virtually no reason to compete, as there is no one to really compete against. Another important part of the conversation is espionage, mainly concerning the use of spies to gain knowledge of enemy technologies and manufacturing techniques, which can then be reapplied at home. But who's spying on who here and why? In this case and many others, the easiest way of finding out is by looking at who's copying whose homework. Sawant mentions this, contrasting the espionage of the Cold War and the ongoing US-China rivalry. Soviet weapon systems were much sought after by the United States to learn their strengths and weaknesses. Numerous Soviet-made fighter aircraft defected during the Cold War. However, US intelligence is not similarly orchestrating any deflections of PLAAF fighter aircraft, as the United States is not interested in obsolete Chinese technology. Instead, China is stealing weapon data or reverse engineering US weapon systems. Put in more simplistic terms, even the tightly government-controlled media can't help but admit that militarily, there's a reason that made in China isn't synonymous with quality. Of course, the other issue with copying other people's homework is that not only do you need to see it, but also know that they even did the homework. US military manufacturing and development moves incredibly fast, even though the information we've covered in this video is only based on material that's old enough to be public knowledge. Many current military projects are hidden from the public, and we may not know about them for decades. And while Chinese espionage might give Beijing some sneak peeks, they're still militarily catching the light of the United States' long-dead stars. Copying rather than innovating basically dooms a country to second place, putting it at a constant disadvantage against the first-place holder. However, the narrative of the US having roundly superior military manufacturing across the board doesn't give us the complete picture of this very complicated situation, as the US Navy's global dominance might soon be challenged. Although China does have more ships than the US, it hasn't caught up with the tonnage of the US Navy. Even so, China does have the advantage in the shipbuilding department with 13 shipyards, one of which has the same capacity as all shipyards in the US. This puts the US at a considerable disadvantage when it comes to future expansion of its Navy, with US Navy Secretary Carlos del Toro pointing out this inefficiency and calling for an increase in domestic shipbuilding capabilities. Del Toro also speculated that Chinese superiority in this area came from using conscripted labor, basically slaves, from their far larger population. This statement drew fire from various critics, including Blake Hertzinger, a non-resident fellow and Indo-Pacific defense policy expert at the American Enterprise Institute, who said China has a very large pool of available manpower and it wouldn't really make sense to use slave labor in a high-tech sector vital to their national security. This seems unfortunately common that Navy leadership throws stones at real or imagined faults in Chinese shipbuilding, rather than reckoning with US failures over 2 decades to conceptualize, design, and build ships for its own Navy. The Center for Strategic and International Studies paints a similarly bleak picture of the United States military manufacturing capabilities. According to their war game simulations, at its current capacity, the United States industrial base does not have the capacity for supplying the munitions needed for a conflict with China, especially when it comes to long-range precision missiles and the crucial long-range anti-ship missiles, which would be critical for striking and disabling the Chinese Navy. This definitely falls short of the unambiguous military manufacturing superiority that many want to believe the US boasts. But a 2023 piece by Michael Hirsch from Politico paints an even grimmer picture of the United States' industrial readiness to engage in a large-scale conflict with China. He points out how the US has become reliant on international exports for its arms industry, with critical components like solid rocket motors, shell casings, machine tools, fuses, and precursor elements to propellants and explosives being built either in China or India and exported to the US. The problems don't end with components, though. As the US has become more and more reliant on foreign imports, it's also decreased its domestic manufacturing capabilities. Since 1985, around 17,000 companies left the industry, as well as 2/3 of all defense workers became redundant or were fired. We think this quote by Hirsch perfectly exemplifies the situation. While Beijing has made new advances in explosives, most American military explosives are made at a single aging army plant in Tennessee, Forbes reported in March. Ouch! And if that wasn't all, it would be bad enough. Hirsch isn't the only one soldiering this point. According to Heather Penny, former Air National Guard pilot and senior fellow at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, unlike World War II, America no longer has the skilled manufacturing base to spin up and support wartime production. Beliefs on this are in no way unanimous, but they're important data points that serve to contradict the prevailing narrative around US military manufacturing superiority. What's important with all this in mind is that we continue to see the forest for the trees. While the US having greater military manufacturing capabilities than China might give it an edge during a potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait, it might not be enough to stop a war from happening in the first place, which should always be the key objective. For a long period of time, many in the world of US military and foreign policy have adopted Teddy Roosevelt's big stick ideology, inspired by the famous saying, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." It's a belief compared by many to the concept of gunboat diplomacy, a 19th century school of naval thought that insisted on using conspicuous displays of military power to influence foreign powers to behave in the manner you want them to. But big sticks and gunboats may not be as persuasive as they used to be. A 2023 paper by Ezra Cohen and Dan Platt of the Hudson Institute suggested that matching China's military might in the area might not actually be an effective deterrent against an invasion of Taiwan. The report states that rather than preparing to fight the Chinese Navy, the US should focus on disabling the systems that would support an eventual invasion of Taiwan. By focusing on electromagnetic and cyber warfare, the US could combat the PLA in a much more cost-effective way. Is the correct way to counter China by ensuring the US military manufacturing machine continues to outpace them, or by investing more resources into indirect warfare, diplomatic and economic pressure, and gray zone attacks? As in almost all cases, the answer is likely a little of column A and a bit of column B. But as long as the United States maintains military manufacturing primacy, that will at least be one feather in their cap. Curious what would happen if China tried to fight the US Watch what would happen if China and the US went to war hour by hour, or watch this video instead.